Hi, sleeping for hours family. Before you sleep, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our nightly videos. A city can be loud and still keep its biggest secret in a whisper. Picture a quiet figure slipping down a wet Chicago sidewalk under gaslight, hat brim low, coat neat, shoes polished. He doesn't shout orders, he doesn't slam doors, yet the street itself seems to listen. On corners where others brag, he simply nods. Where others swing fists, he straightens a tie and waits. Men twice his size watch his eyes before they speak. Politicians glance over their shoulders when a clerk brings an envelope. Cops wave a traffic line through at the sight of his car. In a world of noise, he moves like a hand on a clock, steady, exact, calm. His name doesn't fill headlines like the thunderous ones that came later, but the thunder looked to him for rain. This is the story of Johnny Torrio, the organizer behind the legends, the planner behind the heat, the careful mind that shaped the underworld into a business. No shouting, no swagger, just a plan, and the patience to let it bloom. Before Chicago ever learned his steps, there was a boy stepping off a ship into New York's harbor with a mother who carried more hope than luggage. He had been born Don Antonio Torrio, in Italy, and New York gave him a new name and a new language to learn. Tenements rose like cliffs, pushcarts crowded the streets, clothing lines sagged between brick walls like flags of 100 homelands. He watched men bargain in a dozen tongues, and saw how food, rent, and safety all hinged on who could organize a deal. The lesson sank in early. The neighborhood ran on arrangements. He wasn't tall and he wasn't loud, but he noticed everything. He carried groceries, swept floors, ran errands, and learned to add columns in his head. A shopkeeper liked the way the boy counted change twice, and smiled only after the numbers matched. People remembered him because he was reliable. In a crowded block of voices, reliability is a melody that carries. On the street, boys formed little bands for protection and pocket money. Some pitched dice, some lifted fruit from a cart and vanished down an alley. He kept the dice games neat, and the lookouts rotated. He wasn't the fastest runner, yet he was always the one who knew where everyone should be standing. In those small corners, he learned a craft. Keep tempers low, keep records tidy, keep promises, and profit grows. Any shouting invited trouble, and trouble cut into business. As he grew, he drifted into circles where street math met street muscle. Pool halls, back rooms, and basement clubs taught him about odds and favors. He heard a name that everyone in that world knew, Paul Kelly, the polished leader of the 5 Points gang. Kelly wore sharp suits and spoke like a politician. He valued brains in an environment that often rewarded fists. The young man from the tenements fit that need. He could tally, schedule, and make the difficult seem routine. Kelly's operation mixed politics, saloons, and protection, and here Torrio refined his method. He met ward healers, precinct captains, night shift cops, and ballot men who traded leverage like currency. He observed, kept quiet, and absorbed how influence traveled like an electric current through a city's wiring. Torrio didn't build an image around terror, he built it around order. He ran pool rooms and small clubs, and kept them clean enough to pass a glance from the beat cop. He learned to pay the right rent to the right person at the right time. He cultivated a style, pressed suit, soft voice, careful accounts. Loyalty mattered, but predictability mattered more. If he told a partner a certain cut would arrive on Friday, a short envelope was an insult. He liked rules because rules made money arrive on time. Stories from those days carry a simple thread. Here was a young organizer who could keep hot heads from wrecking tomorrow's business. If two crews clashed, he found a way to split territory or set a schedule so both could operate without chaos. That made him valuable. In a world drenched in ego, he sold calm. Calm is rare, calm is expensive, and calm opens doors. New York's underworld then was a network of saloons, gambling rooms, and protection schemes woven into politics. That web touched every ward. Torrio saw how vote counts could be nudged by turning out laborers from a favored saloon, and how a timely favor to a police lieutenant could melt a raid. Not every deal worked, not every favor held, but he logged outcomes like a bookkeeper, tracking who delivered and who didn't. He developed a mental ledger of human reliability. Names that later echoed through history moved in his orbit. He knew of Frankie Yale out in Brooklyn with his own saloon crowd, a man equally stylish, equally composed when business demanded it. He saw younger faces too, restless ones determined to climb. Among them was a bouncer with a quick smile and a scar down his cheek, who would one day become the loudest headline in America. For now, he was just Al, handy at a door, loyal when given structure, smart enough to watch and learn from a quiet man who favored planning over show. Around 1909, a message came from the Midwest. Chicago's vice king, James Big Jim Colosimo, had a problem. He ran a flourishing empire of brothels and gambling halls centered on the city's red light district, a neighborhood where lanterns glowed at all hours and music drifted out of upstairs windows. But Colosimo faced extortion from blackhand letter writers who demanded payment and made examples when payments failed. He wanted someone methodical to fix it, someone who would bring order without inviting a street war that could crack the foundations of his fortune. Names were offered. One name kept coming back: Torrio. Chicago was a different kind of city, wide streets and big shoulders, meat-packing wealth and a rougher edge. Torrio arrived to find a maze of ward bosses, aldermen with nicknames, and a police force that listened when the right person spoke in the right ear. Colosimo's world was profitable and flamboyant. His wife Victoria Moresco managed many houses. The money was good, but the noise drew attention. Torrio suggested the same thing he had always suggested: less heat, more structure, tighter books, payoffs directed with purpose. He began to reorganize the empire into districts, with managers reporting clean totals and clear expenses. He found the right aldermen to court and the right officers to invite for dinner. He tracked everything. The extortion threats were real, and in those days letters with crude drawings and demands arrived with a menace that frightened business owners across immigrant neighborhoods. Torrio's answer was not a public crusade but quiet pressure. He identified who was behind which threats, and soon those letters slowed. Chicago heard about it in whispers, not headlines. The message that filtered through the underworld was simple. The new man preferred settlement, but he could make trouble vanish if trouble insisted on staying. That settled period showed Chicago what his style could do. Brothels ran on schedules, gambling rooms paid a regular tax, and city officials received envelopes that made their choices easier. Torrio did not invent bribery, but he mapped it. He treated it like any other expense line, minimizing waste, maximizing efficiency, and reducing random risk. He preferred to avoid violence, not out of virtue, but because violence was bad for a ledger. A shooting scared customers and incited press attention. A handshake secured 3 months of peace at a fraction of the cost. Then the city cracked down. The old vice district was closed, the famous houses shuttered, and targets moved south and west. Torrio adapted. He relocated operations to new streets, shifted hours, arranged new agreements, and kept revenue flowing. He believed in resilience. When a door closed, he found a side entrance. Back in New York, the bouncer with the scar was outgrowing a Coney Island dance hall. Frankie Yale could spare him, and Chicago needed younger energy. In 1919, Torrio sent for Al Capone, giving him a job under a striped awning at a place on South Wabash that would become notorious, the Four Deuces. The address itself, 2222, was a calling card, but the interior was businesslike. Girls worked upstairs, cards slapped tables in a back room, a bar poured whiskey, even before the new national law made that whiskey contraband. Capone collected debts, kept rowdy patrons in line, and did what Torrio valued most. He followed the plan. The country stood on the edge of a change no one fully understood at first. The Volstead Act would soon make the sale of alcohol illegal, and what some politicians imagined as a dry, orderly nation looked to men like Torrio like a wide-open market without competitors in suits. He saw what was coming and ran the numbers in his head. Existing distribution networks for beer, rails, trucks, drivers, storage, buyers with cash, speakeasies on every corner that could replace the shutters just nailed to legal saloon doors. A national law could not erase demand. Demand offered a map to anyone willing to supply it discreetly and consistently. There was a problem inside the empire, however. Big Jim had grown comfortable and cautious, and he was in love. He had married a singer, and with love came a desire for respectability. He didn't want the risk of an illegal liquor business placing a new spotlight on his restaurants and music halls. Torrio, seeing a tidal wave of profit, argued the opposite. Bootlegging wasn't a sideline, it would be the main line, dwarfing every other revenue stream. The disagreement widened into a split no ledgers could heal. On a spring day in 1920, Colosimo walked into his cafe and never walked out. Someone waited. A shot ended his reign. Newspapers ran the basic facts and filled the rest with rumor. Most histories agree. Torrio orchestrated the removal of a partner who stood in the way of a plan. The shooter, many believe, came from Brooklyn on a visit arranged through old contacts. No gore, no spectacle. A man who once loved the limelight was gone, and the quiet man stepped forward into the chair behind the desk. With Colosimo's name off the letterhead, the machinery turned. Torrio and Capone scaled a new enterprise with the same principles as before. Keep it organized, keep it polite on the surface, keep the books straight. Breweries were either bought outright or protected. Deliveries were scheduled like a railway timetable. Bribes were systematic rather than random. He tried to divide the city's thirsty map with rival bosses, assigning territories to prevent collisions. When collisions happened anyway, he pulled back, negotiated, and tried again. This was the beginning of the modern rackets in Chicago, where illegal liquor, gambling, and houses of ill repute all tied into a single business model, with a central manager who thought like a CEO. Along the way, he expanded his Rolodex of associates. The Jenna brothers on the west side, experts at churning industrial alcohol into profit. South side allies who controlled dance halls and after-hours rooms. Cooks, drivers, brewers, warehouse men, bookkeepers, union stewards, precinct men, lawyers, bondsmen. If a role existed, he found a person for it, and made sure that person knew exactly what to deliver and when to deliver it. There is a temptation to picture early bootlegging as car chases and Tommy guns. Torrio's version was more like shipping and receiving. He set up routes, scheduled pickups, backed drivers with legal help if they were stopped, and replaced vehicles on a planned cycle when too many got tagged. When police pressure rose in one district, the loads skipped that zone for a week while the right calls were made. He measured risk like freight and kept the emotion out of it. Underneath the calm, crimes piled up in a clear list, because that's what rackets are. Illegal liquor production and sales, protection schemes folded into union halls and neighborhood businesses, payoffs to public officials, illegal gambling, vice houses under a controlled brand, and when he deemed it necessary, the arrangement of hits to remove those who threatened profits or refused peace. He rarely gave a public sign of anger, but he did not hesitate to pull a lever when the enterprise required it. In his mind, crime was a flowchart with consequences. If a partner endangered stability, the chart ended in a box marked replace. But his preference, always, was order over fireworks. He taught that to Capone, who could charm a room and scare it in the same minute. Torrio tried to channel that energy. He warned against too much attention. He preferred a steady income to a glorious headline. He was no saint. He ran brothels and gambling dens, bribed officials, and structured bootleg pipelines. Yet he saw himself as a businessman, working an open market the law had created by mistake. The courts, of course, disagreed. Citizens did too. The trouble waiting for him lay not only in law books, but also in a rival who thought of arrangement as a weakness. Across town, a different crew held territory where beer barrels rolled just as easily, and money changed hands just as fast. The North Side gang had its own leader, Dean O'Banion, a florist with a smile and a pistol behind the counter, a man as quick with a joke as he was with a plan. For a time there was a truce of convenience. Funerals for fallen gangsters brought everyone to O'Banion's shop, because gangs bought flowers like theaters bought tickets. For a while, boundaries held, then a single deal ruined the peace. O'Banion sold an interest in a brewery to Torrio at a moment when he knew a raid was pending. When the police arrived and the charges landed, Torrio found himself carrying both a legal burden and a sense of betrayal. He prided himself on seeing angles. This time, someone else saw one first. The sting bruised his calm because it threatened the organization he had built. In response, talks gave way to a more final kind of decision. What followed would drag Chicago into a cycle of revenge. Before that cycle began, though, the city still saw Torrio as the measured man in a gray suit, stepping from a black car into a quiet doorway, while a broader underworld learned how to run like a business. He had changed crime in Chicago by teaching it to keep books and schedules, and by teaching lieutenants to think like managers rather than street corner brawlers. He had shown that a city's shadows could be mapped like a transit system, night after night, while band leaders played to packed rooms and speakeasy doors clicked open for the right faces. An empire of ledgers, envelopes, and whispered deals sustained that music. A soft-voiced organizer monitored it all, preferring balance sheets to bullets. Yet the city he shaped would soon demand a bill for the trick he liked best, peace without surrender. The North Side would call that bluff, and the calm would briefly shatter. Chicago in the early 20s felt like a stage where the scenery kept shifting overnight. Reformers won an election and promised clean streets, saloons closed, police wagons rolled with new energy, newspaper columns cheered. To most people that meant the party was over. To Torrio, it meant the map needed redraws. He didn't argue with the tide. He moved sideways and found calmer water. City Hall made noise inside the loop, so he looked to the edge of the city line. The suburb of Cicero, industrial and stubborn, offered something he always wanted: room to operate and local officials willing to listen when approached with quiet persistence. He told his lieutenants to move offices, to pull signs off doors in Chicago, and to set up warehouses and clubs in a place where one visit with a town clerk could smooth a month of business. That shift said a lot about how he thought. This was a man who ran illegal beer, gambling rooms and brothels, who paid protection money, who delivered envelopes and expected favors, who used threats when necessary, and at times cleared away opponents. Yet he packaged all that into a method that looked like municipal planning. He didn't celebrate a score. He celebrated a schedule that worked. Capone learned that rhythm by watching him. In Cicero, the student thrived. He greeted aldermen and business owners, learned faces behind precinct counters, shook hands with factory foremen who could steer crews toward friendly polling places. Torrio valued that charm, but reminded him to keep attention down. The aim was influence, not applause. Even with those reminders, power has a way of drawing crowds. Cicero's spring election in 1924 brought the crowds anyway. On voting day, crews loyal to the outfit showed up at polling stations. They pushed rivals aside, steered lines, told watchers to move along. It got ugly in several spots, and the moment captured the split between eras. The old boss wanted silent control. The apprentices' people played it loud. During that day, Capone's older brother Frank, a steady hand who usually wore a tie and a quiet smile, was killed in a police clash. The news flashed across the city. Torrio saw it as a warning siren. Every burst of street drama invited weeks of heat he would have to cool with favors and money. While he juggled Cicero's needs, an itch on the north side turned into a rash. Dean O'Banion, bright-eyed and quick, ran his territory with wit and nerve. He had friends everywhere, including officers who liked his easy style and judges who admired his garden of roses and peonies. For a time, he and Torrio maintained an uneasy peace. They bought flowers from him after funerals. They nodded at wakes and shook hands when an argument threatened to spill. Another figure helped hold that balance: Mike Merlo, head of the Unione Siciliana, a civic and fraternal group whose leader had real sway among Italian-born men across the city. Merlo disliked open warfare. He told South and North to keep a lid on things. As long as Merlo lived, Torrio followed that advice. He could wait. He had patience like a banker. Then O'Banion made a move that crossed a line Torrio took seriously. The target was the Sebin Brewery, one of several places supplying beer despite the dry law. O'Banion wanted out of a share and proposed that Torrio buy him off. They met among the flowers. A price was agreed upon. O'Banion, with his salesman's grin, insisted on immediate payment. Torrio sent the money. Days later, police walked in and seized the place. Raids happen in that business. That wasn't the shock. The sting was that O'Banion knew it was coming and cashed out just in time, leaving Torrio holding a legal bag. Torrio, the planner who prided himself on seeing around corners, found that someone had slipped a corner past him. He took the arrest calmly and prepared his lawyers. He did not explode. He made a note. Meanwhile, the reform wave in Chicago kept rolling. Mayor William Dever pushed enforcement, and for a while it truly looked like the city would dry up. Downtown restaurants stopped serving wine. Large breweries shut down public-facing operations. Enforcement squads broke barrels and flashed for photographers. Torrio held his people steady. He told them to move trucks at odd hours, to keep warehouses small and scattered, to keep delivery men respectful if stopped. The aim was to ride out the pressure without sparking headlines. If fees had to be doubled to ease a district, he treated it as a temporary surcharge. He had learned in New York that pressure rises and falls. The trick is to endure the crest without tearing the hull. Then, near the end of 1924, the city's strong peacekeeper fell ill. Mike Merlo died on a gray November day. With him went a break that had slowed every rush to revenge. 2 days later, O'Banion greeted visitors at his floral shop, as he always did, apron on, hands smelling of green stems. 3 men entered, friendly, then not. Shots cracked in the air, and the North Side's leader fell among the bouquets he arranged so well. The city understood at once what this meant. Someone had decided that the calm had been broken beyond repair. Many historians believe Torrio ordered that hit. It fit his logic. He had tolerated O'Banion's antics under Merlo's truce. Once that restraint vanished, and a costly cheat remained on his ledger, he concluded that an unreliable partner had to be removed. Names tied to the job surfaced: visiting ally Frankie Yale, and two Sicilian strong-arms, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, often mentioned in those whispers. Torrio said nothing in public. As always, the North Side did not do nothing. If Torrio's rise in history is defined by order, the next phase was defined by a single afternoon that forced him to choose between control and survival. On a winter day in January 1925, he returned home from shopping with his wife. He carried packages to the door of his quiet place on the South Side. A car pulled up. Men stepped out and fired. Accounts name Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran among those who planned or took part. The attack was direct and meant to end a chapter. Torrio went down, badly hurt. He lived, but the message could not be ignored. The North Side had answered O'Banion's death with a strike at the man they blamed. Even while he recovered, the legal case from the brewery raid moved forward. He had pledged guilty to a prohibition count, a calculated choice to avoid a spectacle. A judge handed down a term measured in months, not years. In that bed, between pain and court dates, he faced a decision. The patient, always a chess player, weighed odds and outcomes. The city had grown hotter. Capone had become a star, whether he wanted stardom or not. Rivals no longer trusted half-peace. They sought decisive outcomes. He had taught a way of doing things that kept temperature low. The market no longer favored that commodity. When he stepped out of court to start his sentence, he had already decided what would happen at the end of it. After a short stretch behind bars, where he kept to himself and read the papers like a CEO checking stock sheets, he walked free and called a meeting. He invited Capone and a few trusted men to a simple room, and spoke without drama. He said he wanted out of the front seat. He said he had made enough money to live well, and that he preferred sunshine to sirens. He told Al to run the operation from top to bottom: breweries, gambling rooms, houses, bookmakers, union contacts, ward agreements. He emphasized rules that had made them strong: set prices, avoid pointless fights, treat payments like contracts. He warned that fame brought danger, that photographers stole more than light, that a smiling story in a Sunday magazine could cost a year of peace. Then he handed over the keys. That handover was one of the most consequential moments in American criminal history. It put a brilliant organizer off the stage and placed a charismatic, daring, sometimes reckless figure at center. Capone loved the energy of crowds. He filled rooms with laughter and threats and moved through cellars and ballrooms as if both were built for him. He took Torrio's network drivers, accountants, brewers, security men, lawyers, political friends, and ran it at a higher volume. He paid out more and took in more. He didn't hide as carefully. He liked to be seen at the ballpark, at the hotel, on the street. The brand of the operation changed overnight. Torrio left. Some say he went back to Italy first, to let the noise die down, to visit places he hadn't seen since he was a child. Others say he settled in New York quietly for a while, before crossing the ocean. In any case, he stepped away from Chicago. He cut his profile down to almost nothing. To neighbors, he was a well-dressed man, with a calm manner and a taste for good suits. To federal agents keeping thick files, he remained a name worth watching. A man suspected of directing bootlegging, vice, and payoffs, of ordering removals, of building a system that wrapped criminal commerce in business clothes. But he had no desire to contest newspapers. He preferred to invest quietly and advise when asked. Before that full retreat took hold, there were loose ends to tie. Some rivalries still needed settling. Territories had to be finalized between the South Side and the Guenas, between Capone's people and outfits along the state line. Torrio, even from a distance, urged consolidation rather than endless fights. He had long believed that the Chicago area was profitable enough for everyone if ground rules were respected. He favored sit-downs to map borders, standard prices for beer, a calendar for deliveries to houses and clubs so trucks wouldn't bump into each other on the same street. He argued that bribery, ugly as it sounds, should be regularized so that city employees weren't bidding up their favor. He did not present these things as moral goods. He presented them as cost controls. During the months after he handed the wheel to Capone, the South Side outfit secured Cicero even more firmly. The town's coffers swelled from licensing fees, fines, and unofficial payments. New clubs opened with jazz bands on low stages. Beer went out to diners whose cellars had hidden taps. The profits soared. With that came a visibility Torrio had always managed down. Capone, now the face of the empire, dodged attempts on his life, posed for photographers, gave playful quotes, and held meetings with visiting syndicate figures from St. Louis, Detroit, and Cleveland. He was building what Torrio had sketched, a connected network spanning state lines with shared interests and agreed-upon funds for legal help and political support. The crimes underlying that machine never changed. Illegal alcohol production flourished, guided by city and suburban breweries that paid for protection and delivered product on a matrix of routes. Gambling dens ran day and night, from back rooms with card tables to rooms with roulette wheels. Brothels shifted addresses as needed but returned to familiar corridors when pressure eased, often under new names with the same staff. Payments to certain officials continued, sometimes in cash, sometimes as retainers for consulting. If a shopkeeper wanted peace, he paid a fee for security and got steady deliveries plus a phone number to call when a raid threatened. If a union leader could steer a strike in a way that helped distribution, a stipend appeared. When a rival refused talks and endangered steadiness, removal was planned. These were the levers Torrio had systematized. He no longer pulled them himself in Chicago, but his fingerprints lingered on the way they were labeled. In the North Side, Jaime Weiss took the top chair after O'Banion. He was fearless and relentless, a man who believed that only pressure would bend the South Side. He kept up assaults, and his people scattered Capone's cars with gunfire more than once. The city braced for more. Torrio, from far away, watched with a private certainty. This was exactly what he had tried to prevent. Rivalries had become identity. Each camp fed on the story of itself. Peace would be harder to sell now than any time since Prohibition began. All the while, federal authorities turned their attention to ledgers rather than raids. Breaking barrels for a photograph pleased dry crusaders, but it did not dismantle a network. The smarter agents looked for tax cases and paper trails. They read property records and bank ledgers. They noted which men lived beyond any declared payroll. Torrio understood this risk better than most. He had always kept his own accounts careful, and had a long-standing habit of spreading holdings among family and friends. He created new corporate shells to invest in laundries, real estate, and dry cleaning shops that looked clean to an auditor. He did not brag about tax-free income as some rivals did. He told the few who asked his opinion to stop leaving records that could be matched against their lifestyle. That instinct would keep him out of court for years while others stumbled into well-prepared prosecutions. Before 1925 closed, his reign in Chicago had ended in fact as well as perception. He had been the architect who made crime feel like administration. He had tried to keep it quiet, to settle disputes at tables, to make bribery predictable, to make the city's darker trades run on calendars rather than rage. He had arranged the removal of people who opposed that stability. He had set a price for nearly every problem and paid it, and when he realized that the next act would demand showmanship and violence, he neither liked nor tolerated. He chose exit. That decision is why he lived to old age when so many around him met early graves. Years later, men in other towns would invite him to sit in the corner at conferences and weigh in on questions that shaped the entire country's underworld. How to divide routes, how to settle disputes without endless bloodletting, how to move from street corner rackets to broader enterprises like garment trucking, food markets, and union influence. He had opinions, and people listened because he had already proven that chaos can be transformed into a chart if a calm head insists on it. What Chicago felt in those months, however, was the absence of the original calm. The city pulsed differently. Bands played louder, reporters worked later, politicians practiced two smiles, one for reform clubs, one for private dinners. The trucks still rolled, the liquor still poured, but the temperature on the thermometer of vice ticked up. The man who had always lowered it checked his investments, folded a newspaper, and preferred to walk in neighborhoods where no one recognized him. If you were on a late train leaving the city around then, and glanced at a quiet gentleman reading a financial page, you might have seen him. You wouldn't have guessed his influence. That was always his trick. He wore a suit like a shield, spoke with a softness that made people lean closer, and never forgot the central lesson from the tenements: organize need, and you organize power. He'd done it first in New York's back rooms, then on Chicago's South Streets, then in a suburb with factories and simple houses. Now he intended to do it on a different scale, with fewer risks and more insulation. The streets he left behind would write a louder history. When you're ready, we can follow him across the ocean and back, into boardrooms disguised as hotel suites, into quiet meetings where the shape of national rackets took form, and into the years when taxmen and reformers learned that the way to catch an organizer is not by counting barrels, but by counting dollars. He left with a small bag, a folded suit in tissue paper, and a decision he didn't intend to reverse. Chicago faded into a rumor behind him. He wanted a place where the phone didn't ring with urgent news, and the morning didn't start with a list of people to calm. A ship offered that. The deck a long strip of wind where a man could think about numbers instead of grudges. In every story, there's a moment when the main figure steps off the stage, and for a while just listens from the back of the theater. That's what he chose. Distance. Italy was not the romantic quiet he imagined. The country moved under a firm hand. The state wanted parades, not private arrangements. Old country societies that once handled their own business found themselves scrutinized. The government's message to anyone with a reputation for organizing outside official channels was simple: not here. Torrio sensed right away that this was no place to plant new roots. He kept respectful, visited a few relatives, walked streets that felt familiar and foreign at once, and read the newspapers for signals. The signals were clear. For a man who prized steady ground, Italy in those years was not it. So he drifted back across the Atlantic, not to Chicago but to New York, the city that had taught him how to think in systems. He returned as a quieter version of himself, the suit a little darker, the smile a little thinner. He rented a tidy apartment, put his name on nothing loud, and let a few old friends know he was around if someone needed advice. The Underworld, now flush with bootlegging money from coast to coast, had grown into a set of regional firms. Each had its own warehouses, drivers, barges, breweries, and backroom investors. Every region had its detectives for hire, its lawyers on retainer, its friendly aldermen or councilmen. The trouble was obvious to a man who liked maps. The borders were messy, and the tempers hot. He walked into that scene like a consultant. No sign on the door, no talk with reporters, only invitations to hotel rooms where the curtains stayed drawn and ice clinked in lowball glasses. He didn't sell bravado, he sold a plan. If bootleggers in New York and New Jersey fought over ships anchored off the coast, barrels sank and money drowned. If Chicago and Detroit banged heads over lakeshore routes, both paid twice for the same case of gin. If St. Louis and Kansas City argued over a ribbon of highway, 100 gas stations lost business. He proposed something simple in principle and complex in practice: cooperation. Those evenings drew a certain kind of man. Auni Madden from the west side of Manhattan, with his nightclub connections and slick ties to show business. Bill Dwyer, who knew ships and the strange geography of Rum Row. Frank Costello, the diplomat with a gift for placing coin-operated machines where the clicks didn't bother the wrong people. Young leaders from Brooklyn and the Bronx, ambitious and eager to outgrow the old guard. And on the Italian side, faces who would become famous for pulling the old world into a new framework. Charles "Lucky" Luciano, who saw power in alliances, and Meyer Lansky, small, sharp, and comfortable around ledgers. The room in those nights looked like a cross between a union meeting and a stock exchange. Torrio's pitch was always the same: set prices so the market doesn't eat itself, divide territories so trucks don't collide, pool lawyers and bail money so arrests don't cripple a region, keep public fights to a minimum so voters don't demand political heat that costs everyone. He didn't couch this in romance. He talked about cost of goods, overhead, and margins. If someone ran houses, keep them safe and quiet. If someone moved card games, keep the games honest enough that the customers return. If someone ran trucks from Canadian distilleries to New York warehouses and down to Philadelphia clubs, schedule the runs like trains. Be patient, he'd say, and the money will be patient with you. He wasn't the only voice preaching cooperation, but he had something rare: the proof of Chicago. People heard the story of a city where, for a time, rival outfits had been coaxed into a system. They knew he had built payoffs into a budget line and reduced arrests by making sure everyone in a given district understood when to close a door and when to open it. The formal gatherings that followed, some in New York hotels, some in Atlantic City, a few out of the way, became laboratories for national coordination. The one remembered most took place on the boardwalk in 1929, a seaside town full of neon and brass bands, where the talk upstairs was all about keeping the country calm for business. At those sessions, he pushed two big ideas. First, bootlegging needed a clearinghouse so that supply and demand balanced without endless turf shocks. Big coastal shippers could coordinate with inland distributors. Schedules would be shared. Storage would be managed. Second, the future would not belong to one ethnicity or another. It would belong to people willing to partner across the old lines. He praised efficient Irish crews on the docks and careful Jewish accountants in the upstairs offices. He spoke well of Italian old-timers who could still calm a neighborhood with a single word, then insisted that those old-timers must accept younger men ready to modernize. It was, for its time, a radical message. He never raised his voice to deliver it. Not everyone liked the plan. Some leaders clung to the past. Some preferred the chaos because chaos made heroes. But enough saw the advantage. Enough decided that a patchwork of local truces could become something larger, a national arrangement that rewarded stability. Bootlegging profits were the initial glue. From there he encouraged diversification. Gambling rings managed like hotels, with predictable house takes and reliable credit. Coin-operated amusements placed with a written schedule of pickups. Wholesale liquor sales disguised through laundries and tailor shops. And eventually, union influence that could control trucking, shipping, and market stalls in ways that shaped prices without waving a flag about it. He described crimes the way a logistics manager describes inventory, and that tone had power. It removed the thrill and replaced it with a calendar. News from Chicago kept drifting over the telegraph wires. Some of it made him purse his lips. The North Side War kept burning. Names he knew by nickname were now on front pages. There were ambushes, sensational trials, and then a massacre that chilled the city's air for weeks. The kind of spectacle he had always tried to prevent. He was not in command there anymore. He gave advice by phone and letter now and then, urging quiet, carefully suggesting that big demonstrations only invited big responses. But the momentum in Chicago had shifted from charts to headlines. He accepted that and focused on his new role, guide the national scene toward something less volatile. He liked rooms where numbers ruled. A typical night for him in those years might have run like this: a cordial dinner with a small group, one of whom had a ledger, a few hours of patient talk about which suppliers were reliable and which judges answered the phone after midnight, a sketch map drawn on hotel stationery proposing that one side handle certain neighborhoods while the other took responsibility for different blocks, a list of retainers to be split, a handshake with the saved understanding that people would be punished for breaking the terms. When a stubborn leader refused any compromise and began to threaten the very stability he advocated, Torrio didn't organize the street response personally anymore. He quietly endorsed corrective action and made sure the law would not be blindsided by it. In plain talk, he still authorized removals when he believed there was no other option. He simply did it from an armchair and expected it to be done cleanly and with the fewest ripples. The law adapted too. Federal agents discovered that splashy raids were good for cameras but not for durable cases. They followed his advice in reverse. They looked for books. They subpoenaed bank records, followed paper trails, and compared declared income to lifestyle. Prohibition prosecutions were difficult. Tax cases were simpler. Torrio, who had been careful in Chicago and picked up even better habits after leaving, kept his name off assets and spread ownership across a web of relatives and associates. He put money into laundry chains, cleaning services, small real estate ventures, and even the sort of investment companies that made old cash look like new returns. He taught friends to be modest in public. Fewer diamonds, fewer limousines, fewer newspaper quotes. There is a persistent story that as the old world war among New York's Sicilian factions heated up around 1930, he worked the phones and hotel lobbies to push for an end. He didn't take sides. He disliked civil wars because they scorched profits. Young men like Luciano listened because they shared his goal of building something larger than one borough's feud. When that struggle ended and a new arrangement for the city's Italian-run families took shape, it echoed Torrio's themes: a board to settle disputes, rules to divide spheres, punishment for unapproved freelance violence, and a willingness to do business with crews outside the old circles, if those crews delivered and kept quiet. You can argue about who authored the blueprint. What's fair to say is that Torrio had been drawing it, in speech if not on paper, for years. As the 30s opened, he was the Underworld's rare figure, living comfortably, moving freely, and largely out of the headlines. He traveled. He visited Cleveland to talk distribution. He spent time in Detroit, where Canadian connections were vital. He walked through Philadelphia's markets and pointed out which stalls made the best cover businesses. He dropped into Miami, when cold weather pushed certain investors south, and advised on which hotels were friendly to long stays, and which police departments valued quiet streets more than sudden press conferences. He never stayed in one place long enough to become a local boast. He didn't hold court. He attended meetings, said his piece, and left. The crimes continued behind the polite tone. Bootleg liquor still moved until repeal arrived. Illegal gambling stayed a core profit center. Card rooms, roulette layouts, and betting services embedded in telephone exchanges. Protection schemes operated with tidy invoices. A shopkeeper paid for security and actually received it, not a small thing in that world. Labor racketeering, the art of controlling transit points and delivery schedules through influence over union officers, grew into a pillar, Coin-operated amusements and machines, some legal, some not, were placed in diners and bars with collections on a cyclical calendar. Bondsmen and lawyers were kept on retainer. Everyone in the network understood that the price of disorder was exclusion from the table. He didn't brag about keeping order, he assumed it as the cost of entry. Prohibition's end in 1933 changed the revenue map, but not the method. The smartest groups shifted investment into nightclubs with legal liquor, pairing dance bands with gambling rooms upstairs or around the corner. Others turned to racetracks, where inside information and betting handles offered steady returns. Costello, one of the best listeners in those early hotel rooms, built a thriving empire around amusements and steady political ties. Luciano focused on long-term structure and the next generation. Out in the Midwest, Chicago went through transitions and internal fights as government prosecutions finally reached the top. Through it all, Torrio kept his seat near the edge of the room and offered advice when asked. He almost never insisted. Influence, he believed, lasted longer when it sounded like a suggestion. The federal government hadn't forgotten him. In 1936, a grand jury looked at his finances with the cold patience he recognized. Indictments followed for tax evasion tied to income from the golden years of Prohibition. He fought the case with the same calm strategy he used in business. Careful lawyers, measured public statements, no dramatics. Appeals stretched the process out. By 1939, after the legal back and forth had run its course, a judge's sentence became real. Torrio reported to federal custody to serve time. The term was measured in years, but not many. He kept his head down inside, read, exercised, and waited. He had always told others that a predictable cost was better than a heroic failure. He practiced what he preached. For a man who had spent his adulthood avoiding noise, this was just another bill. He walked out early for good behavior in 1941. Older, a little grayer, still neat. He didn't try to reclaim a throne. He rented a modest place in Brooklyn, spent time on walks, and took quiet meetings when invited. If a younger captain asked how to balance the books or manage a shaky alliance, he poured coffee and answered. If someone asked him to bless a reckless venture, he shook his head and changed the subject. He still believed in organization, peace whenever possible, and decisive action when peace failed, but he no longer had any appetite for being the face of anything. Looking back from that vantage, he could see the arc clearly. He had been a teen in New York who learned order on crowded streets, a manager in Chicago who turned vice into a system, a survivor who left before the bullets found him, an advisor who helped stitch a patchwork of regional rackets into a national cooperative, and a defendant who took a tax sentence rather than dare the government to make an example of him. The list of crimes attached to those phases was not small: illegal alcohol production and distribution, gambling operations, brothels under management, payoffs to public officials, protection schemes executed like contracts, influence over unions and markets, and at strategic moments, the decision to remove rivals he deemed dangerous to stability. He did all of this with a style that smoothed the edges, because smooth edges made less noise. If you saw him in a diner in those years, you might mistake him for a retired accountant. He liked it that way. He wasn't chasing legend. He preferred that young men chase the thrills while he minded the lines on a page that told the truth about survival. Age had not changed his baseline belief. You can turn even a wild market into a ledger if enough people agree to be adults about it. If they won't, if they insist on spectacle, then the ledger bleeds red ink and the law notices. He had proved both sides of that equation across 3 decades. Say the word and we'll keep going into the war years and after, when committees in Washington pulled back the curtain on the national network he had helped sketch, and when the quiet man with the orderly mind stepped into a government hearing room and showed the world how a person can speak volumes by saying very little. War turned cities into places that slept lightly. Windows were darkened at night. Ration stamps sat in drawers like a second kind of money. Train stations hummed with uniforms. In that hum, a small man with neat cuffs and a calm walk moved through New York with the patience of a clockmaker. He knew that wartime pressure brought quick cash to the careless. He also knew quick cash invited attention. He kept to his rule. If the crowd ran left, he slowed down and looked for a quieter path to the right. Friends called, some in whispers, asking whether he would back schemes tied to ration books and fuel coupons. He shook his head. He advised against it. He told them that this kind of hustle burned fast and left smoke. He suggested steadier lines, gambling rooms kept discreet, policy banks that didn't cheat their players, jukebox routes arranged with clear splits, laundry chains that washed money and shirts at the same time without boasting about either. He'd learned his lesson in Chicago long ago. The cheapest risk is the one you never take. He rented a modest place and lived like a man who enjoyed routine. He woke early, read the paper, noted which judges had been promoted, and which agencies got new chiefs. He walked to a cafe, paid cash, and listened. A good organizer learns most by listening. In those booths he picked up the drift of the day, which unions could swing deliveries, which docks were watched, which small towns near big cities had mayors who prized quiet streets more than headlines. He did not bark orders. He made introductions. He paired people who could work together, and talked them out of fights that would cost them both. He was retired, he'd say if asked, but retired men don't keep notebooks in their heads with that many names and dates. Across the country, men he once coached kept climbing. In Chicago, the outfit survived the fall of its largest star, changed hands, and settled under leaders who liked steady returns. Frank Nitti held the office line for a while. Then Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo built a culture that echoed the old Tudor's rules. Stay neat, stay calm, pay what must be paid, avoid grandstanding. In New York, younger bosses learned to sort problems at tables instead of on curbs. In Cleveland and Detroit, bootlegging routes that had run like rivers during the dry years turned into freight networks for other trades. He visited here and there, never long, offering quiet advice and leaving before local papers could spell his name. He carried the same list of crimes in his pocket that had paid him in earlier years, only the mix shifted as laws and markets changed. Illegal gambling was now the backbone, floating card rooms, wire services that fed betting lines to handbooks, horse racing parlors that took wagers through a polite clerk who knew when to close the window. Coin machines ate nickels in diners and bars. Collection teams worked on cycles so clean a train dispatcher would nod. Protection, the oldest commodity in the rackets, got sold as a service with real value. Pay in your place stayed open. Don't pay, and you might find inspections piling up or deliveries delayed. Union influence shaped who moved freight first, and who waited. Those who tried to skip meetings or work outside agreements found their costs rising. He had taught this math years before. Order is profitable, chaos is a tax. He kept his own money split among clean-looking companies, a dry cleaner on one block, a small real estate partnership on another, a soda distributor where the paperwork showed neat rows of invoices and nothing to scare a careful auditor. He owned little in his own name. He used relatives and trusted friends as shields. He paid taxes. That last point mattered. He had watched big names fail on math rather than on gunfire. He saw how accountants could be more dangerous than detectives. He did not want a second experience in a federal cell. He told anyone who would listen to keep their lifestyle close to their declared income, no matter how thick the cash drawer grew. That was not romance. That was survival. When the war's noise faded and peace returned, a new America took shape. Suburbs bloomed. Highways stretched. Nightclubs poured legal drinks again. The old on and off flicker of prohibition was gone, but the country's taste for entertainment, gambling, and easy credit remained. He understood at once that the underworld would adapt. He encouraged a shift toward businesses with legal fronts. Pair a supper club with a room in the back where cards moved. Set up a route of machines that play songs in diners, and write contracts that look like any other service agreement. Use union relationships to guide trucking in ways that favor partners rather than adversaries. And where the law was vague, hire good counsel to keep it vague a while longer. In the late 40s, a stir rose from Washington. Senators decided to study how gambling, liquor, and interstate trucking mixed with corruption. Hearings began. Television showed faces once known only in rumors. Lights were hot. Photographers clicked. This was the opposite of the world he liked. He would have preferred to sit in a quiet room and explain to a few key men why loud investigations rarely produce clean policy. The country did not ask for his preference. It sent subpoenas. He received one, of course. His name was a magnet even after years of quiet. He put on a dark suit, knotted his tie just so, and walked into a hearing room with the calm of a man who had spent his life refusing to be rushed. Reporters leaned in. Photos show him composed, soft eyes, hands in place, as if he were waiting for a barber to drape the cloth. Senators asked about Atlantic City, about meetings in hotel rooms, about routes that linked coastal ships to inland cities, about money pools used to bail men out and pay lawyers on short notice. He listened. He gave answers that moved like fog, present, polite, revealing very little. When questions touched areas that could drag him into charges, he invoked his rights in careful language. He said he had left the rough business, that he lived on investments, that he kept to himself. It was not bravado. It was his long-standing method. Give them nothing to turn into a case. Give them no line that can be tied to a specific shipment, a specific club, a specific payoff. Those sessions taught the country names and faces, but they did not teach it everything. The committee made a national splash and helped pass laws. It did not crack the core system he had helped design. That system wasn't a secret handshake. It was a habit. It was meetings instead of street fights, price setting instead of undercutting, shared legal funds instead of panic, and a preference for a quiet payday over a brilliant scene that ended in jail. The cameras captured a polite elder who seemed small for the legend attached to him. He liked that. He had always made himself look smaller than his shadow. In New York after the hearings, he returned to his routine. He ate at the same places, tipped well, read the business page first and the crime blotter last. From time to time, a car would deliver visitors who wanted his counsel. They came with narrow problems dressed as big ones, a partner who dreamed of expanding too fast, a union officer who demanded an increase, a city official whose appetite grew with each year in office, a rash of arrests that suggested someone had stopped paying on time, a rumor that a rival planned a merger not in his interest. He listened longer than he spoke. He asked what the numbers looked like. He asked who owed which favors. He asked whether the press was prowling nearby. Then he mapped a path that avoided cliffs. If a sit-down could settle it, he named 3 people who could be trusted to keep their tempers. If a payment would quiet a district, he suggested a number that was enough, and not $1 more. If a hothead threatened to wreck the peace, he did not wring his hands. He suggested firm correction carried out in a way that did not frighten customers or bring sirens to quiet avenues. Under all of it ran the same crimes that had built his career. Gambling behind locked doors, protection fees dressed up as service contracts, influence trading in city departments and union halls. He had no illusions about any of it. He thought in terms of causes and effects. He knew what worked. One of his old strengths was bridge building between crews that did not share language or background. He had started in Italian circles, but he had always worked well with Irish bosses who ran docks and shipping, and with Jewish partners who ran numbers, bookmaking, and finance. He found it natural to match a talent to a task, and he set an example for younger men who later became famous. Frank Costello cultivated elected support and learned to capture legal income streams tied to amusements. Meyer Lansky built investment structures that washed risk and broadened reach. In Chicago, Ricca and Accardo learned how to make money out of wholesale grocery markets and other boring-looking trades that drew little heat. Each of these directions fit his theory: move from narrow crimes into wider enterprises that touch legal commerce without waving a flag. He also spent attention on the human side. He told his visitors to take care of families, to keep long relationships steady, to avoid the arrogance that comes when a man hears his name praised too often. He had watched leaders fall to vanity. He had watched crews crumble when a boss lost the habit of listening. He understood that crime's first cost is usually paid in pride before it is paid in court. He taught moderation to men who didn't think they needed it. Some ignored him. Those who listened tended to see fewer raids, fewer surprise indictments, and fewer funerals. With age came a certain stillness. He walked more slowly. He dressed as carefully as ever. He had a barber he preferred, a route he liked to take on cool afternoons, a bench where he paused to read. Neighbors knew him as a quiet gentleman who kept to himself. Children could have walked past him 100 times without suspecting that the old man by the bakery had once pulled strings that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. He held that contrast in his pocket like a coin. It was the proof that staying small in public was the best protection any planner could buy. The federal files with his name on the tab got thicker, then thinner. Agents retired, and younger ones picked up the thread, puzzled that a man with such a fearsome reputation gave them so little to grip. He received visits from detectives now and then, who asked the same questions the senators had asked. His answers never changed. He said he was comfortable, that he invested, that he had given up the hard life. When they pushed, he smiled like a father hearing a child insist on a bedtime story he didn't intend to tell again. He knew that time was on his side. If he made no big mistakes, most storms would pass. He liked to say, if you caught him in a warm mood, that the best move he ever made was stepping off the main stage when he did. He had seen too many bright men grab at one more year, one more contract, one more parade of cars, and pay dearly for it. He left when the market for calm was shrinking in Chicago. He traded a throne for a chair in the corner of a room where younger men leaned forward to catch his words. It wasn't modesty, it was calculation. A strategist always asks what position gives the highest return with the lowest risk. To him, the answer became simple once he spent a few days with a hospital's white ceiling above him and a judge's calendar ahead of him. He chose a longer road. In the background, new currents formed. Cuba became a draw for winter fun and investment. South Florida filled with hotels. Las Vegas pushed neon into the desert. These places attracted men he knew. He was not a developer there. He offered notes. He warned against fights that might spook bankers. He suggested they hire the right accountants before they hired architects. He stayed a train ride, or a short flight away, content to watch a new generation test the theory he had preached since the days of the 5 Points pool rooms. Organize desire, and you can predict the cash flow, keep your promises, and you can smooth the weather. The list of acts attached to his name did not grow much in those late years, which is part of why he outlived so many. His record still showed the crimes that made him notorious: running brothels under a system, managing gambling rooms, arranging protection, building and directing bootleg distribution, paying officials, leaning on union ties, and when he believed it necessary to protect stability, planning or approving removals. He did not add spectacular new chapters. He repeated a theme: safety comes from order, and order comes from quiet work more than from daring headlines. He understood legacy in a practical way. He didn't care for statues or myths. He wanted the ideas to stick. The idea that criminal groups can act like firms. The idea that disputes can be handled by councils instead of street shows. The idea that a city's hidden trades can be made predictable, which makes them less frightening to a public that wants peace even while it seeks excitement after dark. He saw his influence in how other men structured their books and set their schedules. That was enough. Toward the end of the decade, his path narrowed in a domestic way. He kept fewer appointments. He took longer to finish a paper. He noticed stares more than he once did, yet his mind stayed sharp. He could still spin a problem into parts and gather it back into a plan. He still took calls from old students who wanted to know, one more time, how to lower the temperature in a district where rivalries had grown hot. He would say what he had always said: bring them to a table, count the dollars at stake, set prices, set routes, promise to punish freelancing, and then make good on promises. It had worked in one city during the 20s. Properly adapted, it worked in many cities during the 40s. He did not fear the end that finally approached. He had made peace with an unglamorous truth. A man who stays off the front page and pays his bills on time can die in a bed instead of on a sidewalk. That was his quiet boast. In a world that minted martyrs and legends by the month, he had steered his ship differently. He had chosen calm seas even when storms might have offered brighter tales. When the time came for him to sit under bright lights before the nation and answer hard questions, he kept his tone measured and his answers safe. When the time came to close his door and live like a private citizen, he embraced the simple rhythm. If you look at photographs from those years, you see a face that gives away little, a neat mustache, eyes that measure rather than threaten. That's the man who designed much of what came to be called the National Syndicate without ever needing a title printed on a card. We can follow him now through those last years, watch the city change around him, and see how the order he loved tried to hold as the spotlight moved to new towns and new kinds of deals. He would not be on those trips. He had done enough traveling. He would be in Brooklyn most days, or on a train for a short visit before returning to his simple apartment. He had one more public duty left, one more brush with officialdom, and then a final quiet day that matched the life he fought to keep. Controlled, routine, untroubled by crowds. When you're ready, I'll take you to that closing stretch, and the moment when a calm heart finally gave out, leaving behind a map others used long after his name stopped appearing in print. Television lights can test any man's balance. They flatten faces, heat the room, and make silence feel like a verdict. When the country tuned in to watch senators ask how gambling circuits, liquor routes, and city favors moved across state lines, a small, tidy figure with a measured gaze took a seat and folded his hands. He had spent a lifetime arranging meetings behind curtains. Now the stage crew and camera operators stood only a few feet away. He didn't fidget. He nodded, answered what he could in soft tones, and declined what he judged unsafe with the rights the Constitution allowed. The room wanted confessions. He offered a lesson in restraint. He had been called many things over the decades: organizer, gentleman boss, architect of quiet systems, and by 1950 the labels had hardened into a folklore that didn't match his modest presence. At the table across from him sat senators and counsel who knew the storyline: bootlegging fortunes turned into gambling networks, protection money turned into political leverage, the word syndicate used by newspapers to gather 1,000 rumors into one shadow. They asked about hotel meetings near the sea, where numbers were whispered and borders drawn. They asked about money set aside to help defendants and families when raids hit. They asked whether rivals in distant cities took directions from a central plan. He listened, adjusted a cuff, and answered as if mathematics, not myth, had brought him there. He did not give them a map. He never had. He spoke of being retired, of investing in small, clean companies, of living quietly. He acknowledged knowing men whose names filled headlines, because who in that world could pretend otherwise? But each time the questions turned sharp. Were you present when prices were fixed? Did you arrange territory? Did you order removals? He let the law's shield do its work. He had learned after his 1936 tax indictment, after appeals that ended in a 1939 sentence, after the quiet stretch inside that concluded in 1941, that the government's patience can outlast pride. He would give them no sentence to circle in red ink. The committee's counsels, trained to read faces, watched him closely. They saw no swagger. They saw a careful mind that had not lost its edge. Reporters noted the contrast between reputation and posture. No threats, no excuses, just the slow drip of "I respectfully decline" and "I cannot recall," said in a voice that never rose. Viewers across the country saw someone who did not match the movie gang boss in their imagination. That was always his edge. When a man refuses to play the part written for him, the scene loses force. Outside the hearing room, he kept the same routine he had perfected since stepping away from Chicago in the mid-20s. Morning papers first, especially the financial pages. A walk, coffee, a mental note about which federal offices had new chiefs and which city departments shifted personnel. He believed that structure mattered more than personality. When the structure changed, risk changed. He adjusted his counsel accordingly. If a city's new commissioner prided himself on clean books, deliveries paused until the right introductions could be made. If a prosecutor wanted a headline, he advised against making that district carry any load that could be rerouted. The world he had helped model did, in fact, stretch from coast to coast by then. Bootlegging had given it shape. After repeal, gambling, nightclubs, jukeboxes, betting services, and union-linked logistics gave it a steady pulse. Men he knew by first name had become regional anchors. In New York, Frank Costello built influence by focusing on amusements and stable ties rather than bang and flash. In Chicago, Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo turned their city's outfit into a quiet machine that invested in wholesale markets, delivery systems, and a web of small firms that raised little alarm. In Cleveland, Detroit, and St. Louis, local groups learned to coordinate routes instead of colliding at the city limits. He did not command these men. He did not need to. He had spent years teaching a vocabulary, margins, schedules, retainers, counsels, and the risk costs of obsession. He understood that his own portfolio must always be simple to explain. So he spread money through laundries, dry cleaning shops, distribution outfits, modest real estate partnerships, and a few investment vehicles run by men who knew not to advertise. Paperwork was kept clean, income taxes were paid, lifestyle was quiet, the sins no longer visible in public, brothels discreetly managed through intermediaries, card rooms that rotated locations, protection fees addressed as service, with a line on a ledger, stayed behind other people's doors. He had arranged these methods long before. Now he supervised by suggestion, not by signature. Even in this low-key phase, his past made a steady drumbeat in official files. Agents still clipped every mention of his name. Detectives visited now and then to see if the small man would slip. He never did. He treated each conversation like a ledger entry. What is at risk here, and what can be gained? If the risk outmuscled the gain, the answer was silence. This, in essence, had been his ruling principle since New York tenements. Do not throw away tomorrow for a story you can tell tonight. The hearings that sharpened the national gaze on interstate vice ran through 1950 and 1951. Names of famous nightclubs and prominent local figures scrolled across television screens for the first time. The committee produced a show that changed how the public thought about organized crime. It focused the country on wire services that fed bookmakers in multiple cities, on gambling circuits that moved cash through hotels and bus stations, on corruption in trucking and market stalls that appeared dull to the eye but carried enormous influence. If anyone needed proof that the trade had gone national, there it was on the screen. He watched with the dispassion of a planner critiquing a competitor's presentation. The senators highlighted spectacle. He saw systems. He noticed where the drawings of those systems were wrong and where they came uncomfortably close. When his turn on the stand ended, he stepped off the stage as smoothly as he had stepped onto it. He left no quote for front pages to blare. He gave no angry response in the hallway. He walked into the New York afternoon in the same dark suit and returned to the habits that had secured his old age. He was over 68 by then, seasoned, calm, and very aware that the next mistake would not be forgiven. Around him, the world kept shifting. Luciano, the most talented of the younger modernizers from the early 30s, had been deported after his prison term and lived in Italy, where he kept contacts, and according to various accounts, tried to knit together international schemes in narcotics and shipping. Torrio watched at a remove. He neither endorsed nor condemned. He drew one conclusion he had long held: the farther a business stretched from familiar oversight, the more points of failure it gained. It was not an accident that he had built his own life around projects he could see and steady. In New York, Costello's era began to fray under pressure from rivals who favored street muscle and narrower loyalties. He recognized the pattern instantly: an older leader urging restraint, a challenger insisting that the public story should be different, a government watching with interest. He had lived through this in Chicago. He knew how these contests often ended. In Chicago, Ricca and Accardo played long ball, staying polite and dull in public. That pleased him. Dull was safer than brilliant. By the mid-50s, people who had once taken his calls immediately now reached out only for very specific matters: a jurisdictional dispute between crews in sister cities, a union official whose demands crossed from sustained to abusive, a plan for a joint venture that needed a neutral to design the split so no side felt cheated in advance. He took those meetings 2 a week at most in cafes or hotel rooms without printed stationery and asked the same questions every time. What does the math say? What is the cost of a fight? Who will enforce the agreement when a hothead decides rules don't apply to him? Then he turned those answers into a schedule, a number, a name. He did not promise peace. He promised order. Peace is a gift. Order is a product. He sold the product. He could still list, with unblinking honesty to his own conscience, the catalog of criminal conduct that had shaped his life. He had built and directed bootleg networks in defiance of federal law. He had run brothels and gambling rooms, ensuring that patrons spent freely and quietly. He had made systematic payoffs to public officials and candidates. He had arranged protection schemes for businesses that wanted safety in rough neighborhoods. He had guided influence in unions that controlled trucks, markets, and docks, turning labor's schedules into levers. And when a rival or a partner endangered structure beyond repair, he had authorized removals. The difference between him and many others who did similar things was simple. He insisted on restraint, on rules, on limits. It didn't absolve him. He never pretended it did. It was his method. He read books in those years, mostly history and economics. He liked stories about builders who understood that a city's true frame is invisible: pipes under streets, wires behind walls, routines people take for granted. He smiled at that, because he had spent a lifetime building an invisible frame. He took care of his mother in earlier years, quietly supported relatives, and treated old friends like accounts that needed attention now and then. He believed that loyalty, like interest, compounds. On spring afternoons, he sometimes stopped in small neighborhood shops to talk with owners like any other loyal customer. A barber shop was among those places, a few blocks from his apartment, where the chairs were polished and the talk was about ball games and weather. He liked the rhythm. He liked being another man under a white towel listening to the radio's tin music. Age had slowed him, not dulled him. He still looked like what he had always pretended to be: a careful, soft-spoken investor. That season in America brought its own dramas. In Chicago, as the decade gathered speed, the outfit adjusted to new pressures and opportunities, investing in legitimate fronts while keeping a hand in illicit trades. In New York and New Jersey, jockeying among factions led to fresh sit-downs and the occasional public scare. In upstate New York, a later gathering of powerful men would be broken up by state police in a small town, sending photographs of rumpled suits and hats into papers nationwide. He would not live to see that mess. It came months after his life reached its close. But he would have predicted the principle: large meetings are magnets for attention. A few months before that famous country house raid, on a day that began like any other, his heart warned him that the long run was nearly over. The signal came not with drama, but with the heavy hand. Time eventually lays on everyone. He felt a weight in his chest, sat still, and waited for it to pass. People nearby saw only a neat man taking a moment to rest. The episode eased, then returned. Friends helped him home, and a doctor was called. Through that afternoon and evening, he faded gently, the way he had always wanted, in a bed and not on a curb, in quiet and not under sirens. The date was April 16, 1957. He was 75 years old. Obituaries were brief, respectful, a little puzzled that a figure credited with having helped design a national system of illegal enterprise could leave so little fresh material for a front page. He had kept the records where no one could seize them, inside the heads of men who spoke sparingly. He had never been photographed draped in theatrical luxury. He had never delivered a speech about power. He had simply, consistently, built lanes and told drivers to stay in them. The aftermath looked exactly like he would have predicted. The machine did not stop because its quiet builder was gone. Offices changed hands, some smoothly, some not. In New York, alliances realigned. In Chicago, routines held. The country's new headline in that same year would be a rural crackdown that revealed just how wide the web had stretched, a discovery that arrived too late to be news to him. He had lived long enough to see committee hearings put the word syndicate into living rooms. He did not need a state police roadblock to confirm what he had known since the 1920s. Coordination, not chaos, shapes markets. His influence is easiest to measure in the rules that outlived him. Crews in different cities used councils to settle disputes. Prices for certain services were set in meetings rather than in alleys. Lawyers and bail funds were shared. Union influence was treated as a neutral tool rather than a weapon to be waved wildly. Public drama was discouraged not out of mercy but out of profit sense. These practices did not make crimes lawful. They made them predictable. That was his signature. The law, for its part, learned from him as well. Prosecutors moved away from splashy raids toward paper cases. Tax returns became ropes. Surveillance turned to phones and ledgers rather than bars and basements. Task forces linked federal and state offices the way the rackets linked cities. In a strange symmetry, his insistence on business-like order pushed law enforcement to become more business-like too. If you gather the milestones of his life on a single page, they read like a parable of American urban growth, immigration and tenements, ward politics and protection, reform campaigns and vice districts, a national liquor ban that created the largest black market the country had ever known, a shift from street fights to boardroom-style sit-downs, tax prosecutions, televised hearings, an elderly man answering carefully as a senator searched for a thread to pull, and then a quiet end. The crimes were real. The harm they caused existed in hidden accounts and in families who lost members to a private calculus that favored stability over individual lives. He knew that, even if he did not say it aloud, he had chosen his path early and never left it. He once taught young men that a street can be tamed by turning it into a schedule. The truth at the end of his life was more complicated. Schedules can make the rougher edges less visible, but they do not erase them. He built order in the shadows. He did not pretend that light would love it. For those who study the period, Johnny Torrio stands as a hinge figure. Before him, much of American organized crime resembled storms, sudden, violent, and short-lived. Under his influence, it became climate, steady, structural, and woven into daily life. He didn't invent bribery, gambling, or illicit liquor. He organized them with a manager's eye and a survivor's caution. He sought alliances across old divides, preached against pointless public heat, and treated violence as an ugly last resort. He left behind no memoir. He left methods. If you want to follow what those methods did after 1957, how the commission adjusted, how regional powers pivoted into new industries, how law enforcement adapted, and how later scandals exposed strains in the order he loved, we can walk that path. It will still be his story, told through the living echo of his rules, through the men he coached, and through the systems that kept running long after the calm voice that set them in motion fell silent. Stories about him kept moving even after the man himself was gone. In barber chairs, in diners just before closing, in booths where the coffee had gone cold, people leaned in and tried to explain how a person so small and soft-spoken managed to shape the lives of loud men in loud cities. They told each other how he taught crews to think like storekeepers, how he made rough trades look like delivery routes, how he replaced temper with timetables. They argued over whether he had been the brain behind one decision or another, whether he had tipped the scales at a crucial meeting, whether he had whispered guidance that later showed up as a policy. What they all agreed on, even if they came from different corners, was simple. The man knew how to turn chaos into routine. Go back to his first classrooms, the streets where boys looked for a way to keep their pockets full and their heads attached. He learned early that impatience cost money. He also learned something most kids missed: agreements are more valuable than threats. In those cramped rooms above saloons, he watched how a signature on a card could move a precinct captain, how a pile of coins on a table could buy a few hours of quiet, how a look from the right man could settle a dispute without anyone standing up. He carried those lessons out of New York and into Chicago with the care of a craftsman packing tools. He brought the same method to every place he touched afterward. In Chicago, the work he led left a clear trail even if it tried to erase itself in the moment. He reorganized brothels into districts, gave each district a manager, and taught managers to count every dollar. He set a standard payment for protection and insisted that it be recorded in a private ledger so no one could pretend they had already paid when they hadn't. He mapped gambling rooms and set rules for how far apart they should be so customers weren't split in ways that ruined both houses. He hired lawyers to know the habits of every judge who might see a case. He paid officers on a schedule and expected discretion in return. He taught drivers how not to stand out, how to run beer or spirits like deliveries for a bakery, and when intimidation was required, he wanted it swift and low. The city saw the public face, music, dance floors, laughter, without seeing the grid behind it that kept trucks from bumping into one another. Election seasons told you everything about his style. In Cicero, when it mattered most, he sent crews who stood where it counted and leaned just enough to sway lines. Ballots didn't always get where they were supposed to go. Opponents found doors stuck, tires flat, the day longer than they expected. It was not the only time he bent democracy to business, but it was the clearest. He didn't celebrate it as a victory speech. He measured it as an investment, a cost paid up front to make a town friendlier to trucks, permits, and late-night hours. He didn't pretend otherwise. He just disliked noise about it. The list of things he did that broke laws is long, and he never tried to decorate it. He ran brothels with managers and schedules. He operated gambling rooms with house rules and steady percentages. He sold protection to shopkeepers and club owners, offering the kind of guard that prevents trouble rather than waits for it. He bought officials and expected them to be dependable. He wove his way into unions that controlled docks, trucks, and markets so that delivery plans matched his own needs. He built bootleg routes that ran from breweries and warehouses to speakeasies and nightclubs despite the dry law, a network so tight that bartenders knew which hours to expect a knock and which alleys served as the last block of the chain. And when a person refused to deal or couldn't be trusted to keep a truce, he approved removals. He treated those choices as grim maintenance, not theater. When prohibition ended, he did not mourn. He had predicted it and urged partners to be ready with other income. Legal liquor returned to bars and dining rooms, and the underworld adjusted. He urged friends to shift resources to amusement machines, racing bets, hidden card clubs, and dinner spots where the front was bright and the back room was steady. He liked businesses that could pass a glance, where the paperwork looked normal, where a tax bill could be paid without drama. He favored laundries, dry cleaners, soft drink distributors, small real estate offices. Money moved through names that did not excite headlines. When agents came calling, he wanted every piece of paper to sit exactly where it should. The national picture widened, and he fit himself into it with the same modesty. He did not wear a crown. He did not summon people with fanfare. He accepted invitations to hotel suites and boardwalk apartments. He sat with owners of ships that parked off the coast. He sat with inland men who controlled trucks and warehouses. He sat with ward builders who knew which inspector needed a holiday envelope and which one needed a promotion. He did not pretend that city borders meant anything to a good supply chain. He proposed price floors, so a bottle sold in Cleveland wouldn't undercut one in Philadelphia so badly that trucks started meeting on lonely roads at midnight. He pushed for a common pool of legal fees. He pushed for an understanding that fights cost more than they yield. You can see his fingerprints in the Atlantic City gathering of 1929, when men from multiple regions came together to talk about routes, percentages, and peace. You can see his ideas in the shape of the commission that emerged in the early 30s in New York after street feuds burned themselves out. He did not claim credit, and no one office made him chairman. He acted like the elder at the end of the table who doesn't need a title because everyone knows who can untangle a knot. The emphasis was always the same: share information, divide responsibility, punish freelancing that endangers the whole, don't bring public heat on the network for the sake of pride. Law enforcement learned from him even as it chased him. Agents realized that barrels smashed in front of cameras did not break a system. They studied bank records and business licenses. They used tax returns to build cases. He felt that heat in 1936 when a grand jury accused him of not declaring income from the years when bootlegging paid more than almost anything else. He fought the filings with patient counsel. Appeals stretched the process. In 1939, the case landed. He reported to serve time and spent the months the way he spent everything else, measured, quiet, waiting for his turn to exit and fix what could be fixed on the outside. He walked out in 1941, thinner, older, and as cautious as ever. He did not go back to headlines. He returned to small rooms and soft voices. When the Kefauver Committee turned spotlights on the Underworld in 1950 and 1951, he appeared under oath and gave nothing that could be hammered into a conviction. He invoked rights when needed, smiled politely, and left to read his afternoon paper in peace. The country saw a careful man who didn't fit the poster. That puzzled people who wanted an easy villain. It didn't puzzle anyone who had done business with him. He believed in bridges. He had crossed lines others didn't cross. He dealt comfortably with Irish crews who ran docks and nightclubs. He dealt with Jewish partners who managed numbers and finance. He could sit with an old Sicilian who learned in another century how to run a block, and then he could stand and walk across the hall to talk to a young modernizer who wanted a national plan. He translated. He matched strengths to needs. He asked people to put away disputes that satisfied reputations and embrace arrangements that paid over the long run. When stubbornness won, he made sure the consequences fit the rules. He also understood how institutions evolve. Chicago's outfit that he handed to Capone grew beyond any single personality. After the years of bright noise, leadership settled into a calmer pattern, with figures like Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo turning the machine into a firm that preferred wholesale markets, trucking, and distribution to street spectacles. In New York, Frank Costello's soft style matched the old Tudors. Luciano's structural ideas overlapped with his own, turning local families into participants in a council that settled disputes and coordinated ventures. In Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis, and down the river valleys, smaller groups mirrored the method. You can trace a line from that early Chicago grid to the way bookmakers took lines by telephone in multiple cities without tripping over each other, to the way coin-op collections ran on routes that never collided, to the way union officers learned that steady cooperation meant steady influence. There were costs laid out in the margin, and he owned that, even if privately. Fraud doesn't become less harmful when you call it a service fee. A protection bill isn't less coercive because it's logged neatly in a notebook. A neighborhood doesn't avoid harm just because an ugly decision is carried out quietly rather than loudly. Families paid, whether they were customers who lost money they couldn't spare, business owners squeezed into safety, or rivals who never returned home. He did not argue otherwise. He argued that if these trades were going to exist, and they had existed in every city since cities were invented, then making them predictable reduced broader damage. That was his justification, not a defense of innocence. The end of his life came without sirens, which he considered the proof of his choices. On a spring day in 1957, after years lived in deliberate rhythm, he suffered a heart attack and died in New York. He had been 75. He left behind no grand house, no rumored vault, no memoir. He left habits. The habits were durable. Months later, a famous meeting in upstate New York would be broken up by state police. Photographs of men sprinting across lawns in hats and overcoats filled pages. He would have shaken his head at the spectacle. He would have said what he had always said. Big gatherings invite attention. Attention invites pressure. Pressure invites losses. He had lived long enough to prove that modesty in public is its own shield. From there, his influence shows up in testimonies and documents from people who followed, including a soldier who later told federal hearings in the early 60s how the commission worked, how meetings were called to punish members who broke rules, how territories were recognized across city lines. Those descriptions matched the plan the older man had been sketching in rooms for years. He wasn't a captain on that later ship. He was the designer who showed builders how to use a level. If you pull apart his career to study the wiring, the steady choices stand out. Avoid stunts. Turn cash businesses into contracts. Place reliable men between yourself and direct exposure. Pay taxes so calculations don't drag you into court for predictable charges. Keep a low house edge, and let volume do the work. Align with political figures who prefer quiet streets to crusades. Use union connections to keep deliveries moving rather than to start fights you can't finish. Remove genuine threats with clean lines and forget the theater. Lock meetings in rooms and keep minutes out of it. Trust that memory serves when paper can betray. The last people who knew him firsthand said he was a man of routines. He wore well-cut suits and kept them brushed. He liked a certain cafe at certain hours. He tipped. He read the business page before the crime page. He enjoyed history that dealt with administration, not battles. He cared for his mother until she passed and supported relatives without turning it into a story. He quietly helped with expenses when old friends needed assistance. He didn't raise his voice. Even laughter from him sounded measured. That was not affectation. It was the way he had chosen to live since boyhood. The tale remains compelling because it runs against the grain of a genre built on big personalities. The public learns the names of loud men. He was not loud. He had a talent for seeing patterns where others saw opportunity. He made himself almost invisible, and in doing so created something lasting. Cities change, laws shift, but the need for organization stays. He met that need in a way that made him both notorious and hard to pin down. That paradox, known to all, proven by few, was his protection. Those who judge him will find plenty to weigh. He helped entrench corruption that took years to root out. He profited from trades that took advantage of people who were vulnerable. He put money and structure ahead of moral qualms. At the same time, he pushed against the kind of public violence that turns neighborhoods into battlefields. He kept hot tempers from expanding a feud into a civic crisis. He aimed for arrangements that spared bystanders. He refused to romanticize any of it. He treated it as work, and he wanted the work done efficiently. If you want to understand why a strategic mind like his matters to history, look at what came after him. The later decades brought new markets, desert gambling resorts, sunny winter towns with hotels full of music, shipping lanes that carried more than clothing, alliances with businessmen who held real estate and mortgages. The same rules played: keep calm, agree on prices, protect routes, punishing carelessness that risks the whole. Even as law enforcement modernized with wiretaps, task forces, and partnerships between agencies, the games adapted with paperwork, shell firms, and a preference for deals over gunfire. This duel between structure and scrutiny grew out of the blueprint he helped draft. By the time the last of his close peers had either died or faded, the Underworld had turned into something that his younger self would have recognized instantly, a network where meetings mattered more than muscle. That was his legacy. No speeches, no banner, just a way of doing business that replaced street instincts with managerial habits. It is not a legacy to celebrate. It is a map to study if you want to know how cities actually worked in those years, how private forces tried to make their own order in the gaps between laws, how profits marched along ledgers that most citizens never saw. The story has two parts left to tell. One is how his lessons held when the country pushed back with new tools and a public that had seen behind the curtain. The other is how the students he trained handled succession, modernization, and the temptations that come when the experience of an old guide is no longer a phone call away. Those chapters too belong to his life because they trace the echo of his decisions through years he didn't live to see. If you're ready, we'll follow that echo and watch what remained steady and what broke when his careful touch was no longer there to smooth the edges. Legends grow louder after a quiet man is gone. People who never met him still used his name to explain why some cities ran hot and others seemed to hum along without constant alarms. They said he had a way of turning rough trade into routine, noise into a schedule, rivalry into an agreement that everyone could live with. Old-timers would tap the counter and say that if he'd been in the room, a blow-up wouldn't have happened because he would have convinced both sides to look at the math first. Whether or not that was fair, it captured the truth he lived by. Steady work beats bold gestures. Months after he died, a gathering in upstate New York gave the country a glimpse of the web he had helped sketch. Dozens of men from different cities drove to a country house to talk business, swap news, and settle matters in person. State police stumbled onto the scene, set up roadblocks, and suddenly photographs of startled faces and rumpled suits filled the papers. That day at a rural estate told the public what investigators had suspected for years. The trade didn't stop at city lines. From any seat in the next world, he would have tilted his head at the spectacle. He had warned against large meetings since the days of pool rooms and ward clubs. Big crowds meant attention. Attention meant pressure. Pressure meant lost profit and new laws. He knew that losing control of optics could be as costly as losing a truck. What lasted, though, were his rules. In Chicago, the outfit he once organized moved into a long phase that fit his style more than the headlines that had once defined it. After the most famous chief went away on a tax case, the machine leaned on men who prized predictability. Paul Ricca read rooms gently and thought about the long run. Tony Accardo treated the city like a portfolio and preferred investments that didn't put sirens outside the door. wholesale markets, trucking routes, a share in businesses that sent small payments with calendar regularity. Jake Guzik kept payoffs and political ties tidy, an echo of the neat budgets their old tutor loved. The crimes stayed the same: bookmaking, card rooms, protection, influence over unions that touched warehouses and docks. But the tone softened. Fewer stunts, more structure. That was the only way to stay in business. Farther east, the plan he'd discussed in hotel suites bore fruit and then encountered tests. Frank Costello held sway through ties to city rooms in an easy manner. He was the sort of operator Torrio respected, a diplomat who thought in increments. But New York always ran hot. A rival who liked speed and sharper edges pushed for a change. A shooting in a lobby shook the old guard, and a new set of faces took charge while still using the same framework: a council to settle disputes, partners from different backgrounds, and a commitment to turn street commerce into something that looked like administration. The structure he advocated was durable enough to survive personality shifts, at least for a while. The public's education about that structure arrived in fresh waves. In the early 1950s, a Senate committee put the Underworld on television. A few years later, that country house meeting confirmed what those hearings had suggested. In the early 60s, a federal witness broke a code of silence and described the inner workings of the Italian side to Congress. He laid out how families coordinated, how decisions were made in councils, how rules punished wild moves that endangered the whole. It wasn't a revelation to those who had sat in back rooms with the elder organizer years before, hearing him argue for councils and bridges across backgrounds. It was new to viewers at home, and it pushed government to modernize. Law enforcement learned to fight structure with structure. Instead of smashing barrels and posing for cameras, agencies built long cases. They followed money, mapped phone calls, watched meetings, and compared declared income to living habits. Tax law remained a favorite weapon because numbers don't brag. They just sit there until someone adds them up. In time, Congress created a tool that let prosecutors attack groups as groups when they could show a pattern of illegal acts tied to an enterprise. That shift changed the chessboard. He would have nodded, because he always understood that once crime built itself like a company, the government would eventually write laws to treat it like one. He would have advised his friends to simplify portfolios, lower profiles, and keep the paper clean. His own file, if you gathered it piece by piece, would show a man who understood this evolution before most. He kept investments modest to the eye and sensible on paper: cleaners, distribution outfits, little properties, safe partnerships with men who didn't talk. The crimes that built his reputation were from an earlier era: brothels arranged in districts, gambling managed like a chain, liquor moved in defiance of a national ban, political payoffs set as recurring costs, protection sold with an actual service behind it, union influence used to turn schedules into leverage, and when needed to protect stability, the removal of people who refused the rules. After prison in the late 30s and an early release in 1941, he stuck to a narrow lane. He shared advice, accepted that others would take the spotlight, and treated safety as the highest return on any investment. The men who had studied under him took those lessons into places he never ran himself. Vegas rose out of the desert, and some crew bosses saw in it a clean way to turn cash into revenue that passed as legitimate. Hotels and casinos needed financing, supply chains, unions, and a steady flow of customers. They needed quiet. He wasn't a casino builder, but his method fit that world perfectly. Set prices for services, divide labor, keep peace by punishing grandstanding, and hide the edges behind contracts. In the Midwest and on the coasts, distribution networks for groceries, liquor, and produce became places where influence created a dependable edge. The line between legal and illegal thinned, not because the crimes vanished, but because the fronts got better. That gray zone was his territory. He had lived there for decades, yet the blueprint could be misread by men who loved excitement more than endurance. When people ignored his warnings, crashes followed. The country house raid in 1957 made coordination look clumsy. Later, investigations of labor funds and loans exposed lines of credit that connected lenders to projects in open sun. Scandals collapsed schemes in slow motion. He would have called each exposure a bookkeeping error. Too large, too showy, too many signatures from the same hands. He had always told students to spread risk and keep distance between the cash and the headline. Some listened. Some could not resist speed. You can understand why he cautioned patience by looking back at the worst fight of his career. The O'Banion affair pointed to a lesson he never forgot. One sly move in a city of watchers can cost a year of calm. He believed the Sebin brewery sale, timed to a raid, broke a compact that let a market function. He answered with an action that removed a partner he considered untrustworthy. The North Side answered with an attempt on his life. In a hospital bed counting ceiling tiles, he decided that the market had turned against his kind of leadership and handed the keys to a man built to manage heat. That pivot preserved his life and probably the outfit's continuity as well. He saw the cost of letting pride outrun prudence. That episode explains everything that came after. The distance he kept, the caution he preached, the clean paper he insisted on, and the constant advice to avoid stagecraft. When visitors sat with him in the 1940s and 1950s, they got an education disguised as conversation. He would ask a bookmaker how many phones he really needed, and what margin he could afford on a slow week. He would ask a union officer whether a shorter strike now might pay more than a long strike that scared partners into building new routes. He would ask a club owner whether dimming the lights at 11 would lower the odds of a raid enough to make up for lost sales. He ran numbers in his head, and pulled out a plan that looked like common sense once he said it aloud. The crimes stayed crimes, but the handling of them became less reckless. That distinction defined his contribution. Think back to his first years, because they explain the man, a boy from the old country, raised by a mother who needed him to be reliable, learned to survive in crowded streets where everyone sold something. He watched bosses in the 5 Points mix smiles with pressure, watched ward clubs turn favors into votes, watched bar owners and cops trade courtesies that kept both in business. He learned English with numbers. He found out early that a ledger tells the real story of any room. When a man like that reaches a city like Chicago just as a national band creates a market bigger than any one neighborhood, the match produces a new kind of organizer. He didn't invent vice, he formatted it. His work with Colosmo was the first big proof. He arrived to find a cluster of brothels and gambling spots making money in a way that lit up reformers and wasted cash on chaos. He calmed the extortion threats the old owner faced. He divided territory by function and distance. He put payoffs on a calendar and replaced blunt emergencies with routines. He kept the businesses clean enough to avoid unnecessary raids and gave managers rules to follow. When an argument with the founder over liquor left the future blocked, the founder was removed by someone who waited in a hallway, and the system continued. Historians attach names and dates to that day. Courts never did. That was his pattern, outcomes without headlines, business after sundown as usual. He didn't hesitate to find talent. He brought a young bouncer from Brooklyn West and gave him a street to manage and then more. He sat a careful accountant at the center of the web. He courted aldermen and preferred paying one person on time to paying many people in panic. He saw a suburb as a pressure valve and moved the center of operations there. He rigged an election so his routes would have a friendly town hall. He wrote his rules into daily routines. The catalog of illegal conduct is exact. Brothels, cards, bootleg breweries, deliveries, bribes, threats, election interference, and on select days arranged removals, and the catalog of method is just as exact. Keep records, assign districts, pay on a schedule, speak softly, make the people above you comfortable while you work. By the time national conferences began in seaside towns and luxury hotels, he had evolved from manager to mentor. He stood beside men from every background, dockside operators, nightclub owners, inland transport chiefs, accountants who could make a dollar look clean before tax day, and taught them to share information without losing face. He was not aiming for romance. He wanted a supply chain that could survive months of heat. He wanted fewer funerals. He wanted a profit that could pass for legitimate when a banker asked for a statement. People listened because he had done it already. The government he faced evolved too. A grand jury in 1936 accused him of keeping too much cash off tax returns. He fought and delayed, then accepted a sentence in 1939 and served quietly before earning an early release. That episode reshaped his advice. Pay something and stay off the list of men who brag about being untouchable. Years later, when television showed his face as senators asked him to describe meetings and name partners, he stayed with that plan. He pleaded rights, avoided traps, and left the building with a reputation for calm rather than defiance. That is how a man already in his 70s makes it home for dinner. When he finally passed, the obituary writers didn't know how to tell his story. He never gave them colorful quotes. He never wore the role that movies later made famous. He was the accountant behind the orchestra. Without him, the band still played because he had written charts that others could follow. But the melody of restraint faded. New leaders took the same structure into louder rooms. Some kept his prudence, others didn't. The network he had helped articulate met its greatest test when law enforcement matched its patience and wrote laws that turned the underworld's best trick, a stable enterprise, into the very thing that could be prosecuted. The contest he foresaw had finally arrived. His place in history rests on real acts and clear results. He broke laws in a calculated way for decades, running houses, tables, and liquor routes, bribing officials, fixing local politics, selling protection, steering union influence, and approving quiet removals when talks failed. He also convinced an entire generation to scale those illicit trades like companies, and to create councils that limited chaos. Those two truths live side by side. They don't cancel each other, they define a period. People who knew him in his last years said he moved with small steps, looked for a seat near a window, and liked the sort of talk that circles back to costs and benefits. He never bragged about surviving when so many didn't. He credited a plain habit: avoid scenes. That habit shaped cities long after his name went quiet. It shows up in the way crews coordinated without shouting, in the way prices for illegal services stayed stable for stretches of time, in the way unions gained influence that outlasted any single leader, and in the way police and prosecutors learned to watch paper instead of doorways. There is one more piece to explore before the light turns out on this story. It sits in the lessons people drew from him after the cameras appeared, after new laws changed the game, after younger men tried to modernize again in a different America. Some stayed with the old rules and kept their lives. Others chased noise and lost both money and freedom. You can trace those paths back to a man who taught that systems outlive swagger. In the last part, we'll follow those ripples to see where his blueprint bent, where it held, and what it says about how power is really managed when the public isn't looking. Stories end, but they leave a map behind. His map stretched across decades, tracing a line from a New York tenement stairwell to the quiet corner of a Brooklyn barbershop where an old man waited for a trim and never rose again. Between those points lay the record of a life that turned street impulses into plans, raw appetite into organized trade, and sudden feuds into meetings that sought to settle costs. If you wanted the loud version of that era, you could find it in newspaper boxes on corners. If you wanted to see how the gears really turned, you followed the habits he taught and the echoes that kept sounding after his voice fell silent. He began as a kid who noticed how a block stayed safe when one person kept track of who owed whom and when. He watched Pasanai argue in their own language, learned English by counting change at a counter, and figured out early that reliability is a kind of power. The 5 points showed him that favors move politics, that each precinct has a rhythm, and that a soft-spoken man with good arithmetic can get farther than a loud one with a quick temper. Paul Kelly's salons and pool rooms gave him his first real desk, and he filled it with a method. Set rules, keep calm, and make sure the right people are paid on time. Chicago was the test that made him a legend. Big Jim Colosimo's empire needed order. He delivered it. He cataloged brothels, placed managers, and required totals that matched the last sheet sent. He persuaded aldermen to see the value of quiet nights and steady money. He mapped gambling rooms so they didn't cannibalize one another. He created a schedule for deliveries and a budget for payoffs, so bribes were predictable rather than panicked. He reduced the chaos of protection rackets to lines in a notebook. He dealt with black-hand extortion by replacing fear with organization. That part of his story contains the inventory of crimes that never left his ledger: running houses where men bought what the law forbade, operating gaming rooms where the house took a cut, selling safety through insurance no policy would cover, buying official favor, leaning on unions to turn schedules into leverage, and when he saw no alternative, arranging the removal of men who endangered stability. When national prohibition arrived, he saw a market, not a sermon. He bought breweries by proxy, protected speakeasy routes, set prices so that supply and demand matched without blowing up neighborhoods, and kept the books in a way that let him see losses before they became disasters. He practiced politics with envelopes, with public civility, and with reminders that a quiet neighborhood made everyone richer than a noisy one. He brought in talent when he spotted it. He gave a young bruiser from Brooklyn the chance to run a block, and taught him to think like a manager. He partnered with the Jenna brothers on the West Side, worked with ward healers who could tilt a vote count, and made Cicero a backup city where a day's work faced fewer interruptions. He preferred deals to brawls, but he was not sentimental. When Colosimo refused to move into liquor and risked the future of the whole machine, the founder was removed, and a plan for the new business era began that same week. He did not gloat. He filled the chair and carried on. When Dean O'Banion sold him a brewery interest timed to a raid, he considered it bad faith that threatened the whole pact which kept liquor flowing and streets relatively still. After the city's main peacekeeper died, O'Banion met an ending in a flower shop, and the North Side answered in kind. He absorbed a hail of fire outside his home one winter afternoon, and lived, in a hospital bed. He made the decision that revealed his core belief: survival beats glory. He handed Chicago to his impatient pupil and stepped away. Distance let him become what he had the patience to be: a builder of bridges and a quiet architect of agreements. In hotel rooms with drawn curtains, he argued for cooperation among groups that once settled matters with ambushes. He urged price floors to prevent ridiculous undercutting across state lines. He promoted shared legal funds so one crew's pinch didn't cause broader panic. He included anyone whose work supported the network: Irish owners of docks and nightclubs, Jewish specialists in numbers and finance, old Italian neighborhood liaisons who could still calm a block with a single glance. He favored the word council long before it reached national headlines. He didn't want leaders to love each other. He wanted them to honor schedules. National gatherings by the sea gave structure to those ideas. The men who met there didn't wear costumes, they carried ledgers. They divided coastwise shipments and inland runs. They set standards for credit and collections. They squeezed out freelancing that endangered everyone. Later, in New York, a permanent council formed after an internal war burned out. The new order matched his blueprint: families recognizing each other's fears, disputes decided by votes rather than bullets, rules punishing unsanctioned moves. He didn't sign the charter. He had been drawing it in the air for years. He understood that law would adapt. The Fed who smashed a barrel for a camera had less impact than the Fed who matched a tax return to a lifestyle. He learned that lesson personally in 1936, when a grand jury charged him over undeclared earnings from the flush years. He fought, stretched time, and walked into prison in 1939 with the patience of a man who treated every adverse event as a cost of doing business. He came out early for good behavior in 1941 and returned to the life that kept him safe: small rooms, careful investments, and counsel offered like a craftsman sharing a tool. When the nation tuned its first televisions to watch senators probe interstate rackets in 1950 and 1951, he took a seat under the lights. He spoke politely, invoked his rights, and left nothing in the record that created fresh risk. Viewers expecting a villain found a quiet senior who seemed more like a retired accountant than an underworld engineer. That disconnect is the essence of his survival. He never fit the role people wanted to cast him in. He lived long by insisting on being smaller than his shadow. The list of acts he committed never needed exaggeration. He built and managed brothel districts, supervised gambling rooms, sold protection as a commercial service, bought the cooperation of public officers, influenced union schedules to favor his routes, organized bootleg production and delivery, and sanctioned removals when he believed no other answer protected the whole. He coached others to spread money through harmless-looking firms: cleaners, laundries, distributors, modest real estate, pay taxes, and keep purchases modest. He advised against stunts. He told younger men to accept that restraint is the surest profit. He died in 1957 after a heart attack in a Brooklyn barber shop, far from the noise he had spent a career minimizing. Months later, a state police stop at a country estate in upstate New York showed the public a group of men who believed, wrongly, that they could meet in large numbers without drawing attention. Photographs of rumpled suits on wet lawns made front pages. It was the kind of scene he had warned against since the early days. He would have said that the only meeting that matters is the one no one notices. What followed across the next decade confirmed both his success and his limits. A federal witness stepped forward in the early 60s to describe the internal council's rules, and the country learned in detail how arrangements replaced gunfights among the Italian side of the trade. The government learned to build cases around patterns rather than single acts. The law he would have recognized as the system's mirror took shape at the start of the 70s, allowing prosecutors to pursue enterprises as enterprises. He would have predicted it. He said many times that once a market formalizes itself, it becomes an easier target for anyone who can trace a pattern. To measure his influence, look past the loudest names and find the routines. In Chicago, after the age of bright suits and photographers, the machine became quieter under men who liked distribution, wholesale markets, and favors that kept the peace. In New York, a diplomat's era gave way to a mix of caution and fresh ambition, yet councils still met and disputes still found tables. Elsewhere, towns adopted the method without adopting the headlines. Crews set prices for bookmaking lines and split jukebox routes by street. Union officers who wanted stability found partners in people who preferred a predictable take to a rumor of a windfall. His language, margin, schedule, discipline traveled farther than his name ever could. He also left behind warnings embedded in his own story. The Sieben trap taught him how one slick trick poisons a town's trust. His narrow escape in 1925 taught him that a leader who becomes a target should choose life over legend. His tax case taught him that the government keeps counting while others sleep. His testimony taught him that plain courtesy is armor. Together, those lessons became a rule set that saved lives and money for those who adopted it, and cost both for those who ignored it. The people around him remembered kindness as well as calculation. He looked after his mother, helped relatives with quiet remittances, and kept friendships in good repair without turning them into debts. He tipped, listened, and treated a shop owner with the same care he brought to a table full of partners. He avoided arrogance. He dressed for work, not theater. He did not drink to excess. He reserved his enthusiasm for clean lines, good numbers, and the feeling that comes when a week ends exactly as planned. He had many names. Some called him the Fox for the way he slipped past traps. Some called him Papa because he sounded like a father telling a hot-headed son to sit down and think. In Chicago, he was the organizer. In New York, the consultant. In national memory, the quiet root of a system that changed how crime functioned. He was not a noble figure. He didn't pretend to be. He was a builder who chose to work in the shadows and took pride in work done without fuss. Think about what cities owe to order, even when that order comes from places we wish didn't exist. Street markets pop up wherever demand refuses to die. He didn't invent that reality. He decided to govern it, and he did so by bringing a merchant's patience to a rogue trade. When you stand on a corner after midnight and see cars slip by without incident, you are looking at the kind of stability he tried to buy. Less noise, fewer surprises. The harm that kept moving beneath that quiet was real. He never wrote a line that excused it. He simply believed that any market is safer when someone holds a calendar. A final walk through his life reads like a list of phases, each linked by the same calm approach. A boy arrives from Italy and learns organization in cramped rooms. A young man in New York perfects it under a club leader who valued brains. A manager in Chicago turns vice into a system, removes a founder who blocks expansion, and builds a liquor empire with clear routes. A crisis with a North Side rival breaks a truce, and an attempt on his life convinces him to pass the city to a man built to weather the heat. A consultant in New York argues for national cooperation and helps birth councils that calm the markets. A defendant accepts a tax sentence, walks out, and returns to quiet influence. A witness in a Senate room sidesteps traps and goes home for coffee. An elder dies without drama. A map remains. The crimes cannot be blinked away. Brothels run like franchises, gambling managed like a hotel, liquor pumped in defiance of federal law, envelopes that turned officials into assets, protection sold with implied risk behind it, union leverage used to shift entire markets, and removals that silence trouble at the cost of lives. Yet there is another truth that rides beside the first. In a time when shootings made copy and block wars made noise, he believed in keeping blood off the sidewalks, in spending money to maintain peace, and in punishing vanity that made neighborhoods unsafe. He failed at that aim sometimes. He never stopped trying. A student of him might borrow not his business, but his method. Look for incentives, add up costs, prefer the long road, step aside when the light shifts against you, pay your bills, let your work speak while you say very little. Replace the trades in his story with any other, and the method still holds. That is why his influence escaped the boundaries of his particular world. He made planning itself the star. If you listen closely, you can hear the cadence of his meetings and the way later generations ran their projects. You can hear it in a bookmaker calculating exposure, in a union officer deciding whether to negotiate or walk, in a club owner setting lights to avoid a raid, in a lawyer advising a client to settle quietly rather than fight for a risky acquittal. The echo isn't romantic, it's procedural. He taught a way of handling risk that turned violent improvisation into managed compromise. He once told a young man who dreamed of headlines that fame is a door no one can close once it opens. He said that a crown is a target, and that the smartest seat in any room is the one by the wall, near a quiet exit. He lived that way. He left big chairs to others, and lasted long enough to see many of them flipped over by the same hands that held their legs steady a year before. Nothing in his experience changed his belief that humility is the cheapest insurance. There are details in his tale that historians still debate, such as who stood in which doorway on which day, or how deep his hand reached into one meeting or another. Those debates will likely never end, because he built himself to leave few fingerprints. What remains beyond argument is the shape of the thing he made. Crime run like a firm, with markets divided, prices set, and aggression disciplined. He didn't invent the dream. He showed that it could function in American cities with their peculiar mix of politics, industry, and endless appetite for nightlife. As a bedtime story, his life reads strange, because rest usually comes after a hero wins or a villain falls. He was neither in simple terms. He was a manager of shadows who engineered quiet where there might have been smoke, and who packaged vice in routines the way a grocer packages fruit in rows. If the idea is to sleep, perhaps his story helps because it suggests that even in the most unruly places, someone can bring a kind of order. It's not an order that cures the hurt. It is an order that keeps the roof from shaking every night. At the very end, he sat in a barber's chair, with the day's news folded in his lap, and a life's worth of caution wrapped up like a neat tie. He had outlived men who chased legend, had seen meetings become institutions, had watched television turn whispers into spectacle, and had survived because he kept to the same rule from the first day he earned a nickel in a back room: lower the temperature. A heart slowed, the room stayed calm, and an era closed without a siren. The rest of it, a council in one city, a distribution plan in another, a dispute settled with handshakes that lasted, went on without him because systems outlast men. If a child asked why people still say his name, the answer would be this: he taught a generation to count before they shouted. He taught them to weigh risk before they reached for a stunt. He taught them that structure beats impulse, that schedules beat rage, that agreements beat feuds. The underworld he shaped caused harm, and carried costs that history has to count honestly. He also lowered the number of nights when bystanders had to duck. Both facts sit side by side. History is large enough to hold them. On your pillow now, think of a city under soft rain, lights glowing in windows, traffic flowing, doors opening on time, nobody running. Somewhere in that picture, a quiet man with a tidy hat walks to a meeting where no one will raise a voice. He sits, listens, and draws a line through a problem. He leaves with nothing in his hands but a plan for tomorrow. That was him. That was his secret. Not magic, not menace, just patient math in a world that forgot, for a while, how to count. Long after the lights dim, a life like his keeps flickering in the corners where memory gathers. People try to square the paradox: a figure tied to illegal trades who disliked spectacle, a planner who never seemed to hurry, a boss who spent half his career teaching others to avoid behaving like bosses. The best way to understand him is to watch how he handled small decisions. He always shaved risk off the edge. He kept his voice low when others reached for volume. He made sure yesterday's agreement wasn't undone by a moment's pride. In a world that rewarded impulse, he bet on patience and often won. The early picture comes into focus when you place him on a Lower East Side stoop, a boy carrying groceries for a few pennies, eyes measuring distances between doors and corners. He had a mother who worked hard, and a stepfather who kept a shop. Street clubs taught protection as a form of group insurance. He joined one, then helped run it, and soon learned the value of neat books. The 5 Points Gang, run by a polished leader who wore silk ties and spoke multiple languages, gave him a front-row seat to the marriage of politics and commerce. Ward bosses, judges, inspectors, each had a price or a preference. He didn't moralize. He observed. Knowledge like that, gathered early, doesn't fade. He was still young when a call came west from a man who owned more rooms than a hotel and preferred opera to arguments. Big Jim Colosimo wanted order more than bravado. The immigrant neighborhoods around the old Vice District were full of money on the move and full of risk. Colosimo's wife, a managerial force in her own right, had already built a chain that needed discipline. Chicago's power map ran through aldermen with long-standing nicknames, precinct captains who could fill a hall by dinner time, and cops who knew exactly which hours they shouldn't walk a certain beat. Into that web stepped a small organizer who treated the city like a warehouse with doors that had to be locked in the same order every night. He approached vice like logistics. Houses were grouped by block. Supervisors had quotas. Repairs and relocations were scheduled so inspectors wouldn't trip over the same address twice. Complaints were logged. Street brawls were discouraged because broken glass cost money and pulled attention. Gambling rooms operated as if they were franchises, with rules for credit, caps on maximum bets, and quiet escorts for anyone who drank more than their balance could support. The old black hand letters, ugly extortion notes that frightened business owners, lost force when steady relationships replaced fear with predictability. These changes didn't turn illegal trades into virtue, but they reduced random harm and made outcomes less chaotic. Even critics who hated the trade itself could see the difference in noise. When the country voted to outlaw alcohol, he saw not a moral revolution but a supply crisis. Bottles didn't want to disappear. Demand would migrate underground and pay well for steady supply. He moved fast without hurrying. Breweries with dormant vats were acquired by proxies. Ice houses doubled as storage. New drivers learned routes at odd hours. Speakeasies took shape where skilled bartenders and quiet doormen could keep a room smooth. He set prices so nobody had to smash a rival's truck to survive. Bribes moved from favors to fixed costs so the right hands were fed and the wrong doors stayed shut. The plan produced a river of cash. The break came over growth and risk. Colosimo, newly married to a singer, and at last enjoying applause in legitimate rooms, refused to plunge into the dry era's biggest market. His organizer, eyes on the numbers, believed the ban had created a once-in-a-generation opportunity that would dwarf old income. A man who had spent years avoiding showdowns suddenly faced one. The founder fell to an attack that drew little noise but changed Chicago. Accounts differ on exactly who stood in which doorway. Most tellings agree that the quiet planner arranged it and that a visitor from Brooklyn was trusted with the job. The next day, ledgers filled out as usual. Only now a different name approved the totals. If the South Side under new management was a corporation, the headquarters sat at 2222 South Wabash, a building with upstairs rooms, a back room for cars, and a main floor where introductions were made. The Four Deuces ran like a station. Managers reported. Collections were counted. A bouncer brought in from Coney Island.
Lose.
Proof quick-witted, loyal, and eager to climb. He learned to reward staff and soothe partners, to call aldermen by first name, to pour drinks for reporters when needed and vanish when not. He also loved theater. His tutor kept repeating a simple line, "Attention is expensive." The pupil nodded and only sometimes remembered.
Lose. The city's peace depended on boundaries.
The North Side with its own leadership and its own bar.
Vaunted prices kept fair.
Dean O'Banion smiled easily, charmed police captains with flowers from his shop and treated raids like weather. The Unione Siciliana, a fraternal club with influence where Italian-speaking men gathered, preferred calm. Its president, Mike Merlo, acted as a brake when tempers rose. As long as Merlo lived, accommodations held. Then that anchor slipped, and the next days changed the city's air. O'Banion's role in selling an interest in a brewery just before a police seizure, leaving his rival holding new legal trouble, is one of those moves historians still debate in detail. The core felt simple to the organizer, a breach of trust in a market that ran on tacit promises. A flower shop became a scene of grief. The North Side replied with fury. 2 months later, outside a quiet apartment, Lead tore through a calm winter day. A jammed weapon, quick neighbors, and a hospital bed gave the elder
a second chance he didn't waste.
He accepted a short sentence on a liquor count tied to that early.
A second pounded backward from a difficult truth.
The city's mood had changed. Showmen drew heat. Schedules bent around feuds. A younger man with a taste for larger rooms now fit the job better. When he walked out, he left a big chair behind. He sailed to Europe, then settled in New York, content to shape things from a distance. A stretch of years followed where he became a translator among ambitions. In hotel suites above the Atlantic, he placed dockside Irish bosses beside inland distributors, matched careful Jewish accountants with Italian neighborhood ambassadors, and asked everyone to speak in terms of cost. Meetings in 1929 by the boardwalk became famous long after the ashtrays were emptied. Those sessions discussed post-prohibition futures, shipping lanes, splits, and how to prevent hotheads from inviting national crackdowns. He wasn't the loudest man in those rooms. He was the one who summarized the points at the end. New York's internal war at the start of the 30s ended with a structure he had advocated since Chicago, a council to keep local leaders in their lanes, a code against unapproved violence, and a habit of partnering across backgrounds. Prosecutors eventually learned the shape of that structure, especially after a defector described it to Congress decades later.
The law responded by designing tools aimed at the very thing he had helped bake into the system: continuity. When prosecutors can frame a case around an ongoing enterprise, the manager's genius becomes an easy hook. He would have found the symmetry almost funny. Craft invites countercraft. His own brush with federal accountants sharpened his caution. An indictment in 1936 for income issues related to bootleg-era gains led to a conviction in 1939. And a short stretch inside. He served quietly, read, walked, spoke little, then came home in 1941 to a careful routine. He invested in laundries and cleaning shops, small distributors, and a few steady properties. He kept ownership indirect. He paid taxes and kept receipts. He advised others to stop trying to beat the math and instead make the math boring. The advice kept several men out of prison and probably shortened a few investigations that ran out of spectacle. When cameras turned hot in 1950, and senators asked whether meetings by the sea had established a national network, he sat politely and let the law shield the details. He said he was retired, that he invested and kept to himself. He did not flip tables or deliver speeches about being misunderstood. He knew a hearing is a theater. The safest part is a seat near the aisle, brief lines and a quick exit. Friends like to recall small kindnesses. He wrote checks quietly when old partners fell on hard times. He looked after his mother until she passed. He rarely drank, didn't chase attention, and always arrived on time. A neat mustache, a tie exactly knotted, a hat worn just so. He married Anna, kept home life private, and left no children behind to carry a name through courtrooms. The line that matters most, he stayed small in public, was no act.
It was a long discipline. In Chicago, the organization he built outlived every headline attached to it. It moved from bright noise to careful investment. New figures steered it toward wholesale produce markets, distribution companies, construction links, and quiet stakes in legitimate firms. In New York, Costello's soft influence shared a decade with louder rivals, then yielded to new combinations. Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, and other cities developed their own versions of the method. In each place you can find a brushstroke of the same idea: make illegal trades look like service industries, keep prices stable, punish freelancing that draws fire, treat politics like another cost center, and never invite free publicity. The story has to carry the weight of the harm it recounts. People paid who had no choice. Some bought safety because the alternative wasn't safe. Others lost family members to decisions made in quiet rooms. The order he loved lowered some risks and raised others. He knew that. He insisted that fewer sirens meant fewer stray tragedies. That doesn't erase the losses. It marks the boundaries of his justification, a rationale built on reducing public damage while still profiting from private wrongdoing. History has to hold both truths. Even the language he used shows the tilt. He rarely used words like war, victory, or conquest. He spoke of arrangements, routes, margins, schedules, and discipline. He talked about patience like a craftsman talks about tools. Keep them sharp and out of reach of children. He warned that men who enjoy seeing their names in print seldom enjoy what follows. He had watched careers end on courthouse steps because someone wanted one more magazine profile. He wanted weeks to end with balanced ledgers, not with headlines. Scholars picking through archives still debate details. Was he truly Colosimo's nephew by marriage, or simply treated like family because of a connection through the earlier wife who managed houses? Did he personally choose the men who walked into the flower shop, or did he approve a plan handed to him by allies who insisted the time had come? How much direct role did he take in the famous Boardwalk Conference, and how much did he prefer to act as a sponsor who stayed in the next room and waited for the summaries? The lack of paper trails is part of his design. He built systems meant to be remembered rather than recorded. When you teach people to keep minutes in their heads, historians argue over the blanks. Still, the broad lines stand. Born in southern Italy in 1882, carried to New York as a child, raised in tight streets, mentored under a club leader, who mixed charm with precision, invited to Chicago around 1909 to impose discipline on a lucrative vice district, elevated to empire builder after a founder was removed, nearly killed in 1925 at the height of a feud, sentenced on a liquor charge, retired to a consulting role, helped shape national coordination, convicted on a late 1930s tax case, released early in 1941, faced polite questions in 1950 and 1951, and gone in 1957, after a final quiet afternoon. That arc, with its list of illegal trades and careful choices, is the spine of the story. Stories like his attract exaggerations and lessons. The exaggerations put crowns on quiet heads. The lessons are more useful. He showed that any market, even a forbidden one, can be stabilized if competitors create rules and pay to keep them. He showed that violence, when turned into theater, bankrupts every ward. That one, when turned into theater, bankrupts every. He showed that a small ego lasts longer than a large nickname. He showed that law enforcement learns, and that anyone who builds a reliable machine must assume a prosecutor will eventually build one too. Above all, he showed that stepping aside can be a masterstroke, not a retreat. If you walk past the corner where the Four Deuces once stood, there's nothing there now that tells you men once made schedules in its rooms that affected paydays all over a city. If you stand outside the old flower shop address where wreaths once hung, you won't find a plaque explaining how a handshake over a brewery shit turned into a shock that echoed for years. If you sit in a Brooklyn barber shop on a spring afternoon, the chair feels like any other chair. That's how he would have liked it. No monuments, no markers. He left a style, not a statue. At night, when a city settles and the last train rattles through, think of a figure who believed that even in the grayest corners you can write a plan that avoids loud mistakes. He didn't claim virtue. He claimed method. He did bad work in a careful way, and convinced rough men to behave like office staff. He bent politics. He massaged markets. He avoided making a mess when a solution could be found at a table. That blend of flaws and discipline makes him hard to place in a simple frame. It also makes him a key to understanding how American cities worked in the first half of the last century, where official orders and unofficial arrangements often shared the same hallway. He would advise, if he were somehow still whispering, that you remember the modest truths. Luck matters, but routine matters more. Charisma gives you a good month. Structure gives you a good year. Anger sells papers. Agreements pay bills. And when the room heats up, the smartest person is often the one who leaves it before the curtain falls. He lived by those lines. In the end, they gave him something many in his world never got: age. A pillow and a last day that passed like any other, with the city still running, a newspaper folded on his lap, and the work of keeping things measured quietly done.